the CIA, NSC, and the top intelligence agencies of the United States says that Iran has no nuclear weapons program. Yet everybody in the United States is convinced that it's a nuclear danger. Keep in mind that the original nuclear power program was not something that Iran did on its own. It was sold to the Iranians by the United States.
Met most of you in the audience, and you all seem like delightful people. So I think we're going to have a delightful and hopefully informative evening. Thank you for coming. Tonight we look at the subject of Iran, a country of 70 million people, which is constantly, every day in the news. The charges against Iran and from Iran fly all the time. Many of these charges are brought by the same people who advocated for war against Iraq. And with the cost and outcome of that conflict, it's prudent that we as citizens be well informed about what may be the next war, a war with Iran, a country which is not monolithic and which is spawning what seems to be a vital democracy movement. Tonight, we seek insight from an authoritative speaker and a thoughtful panel that you see here on the stage. We'll be introducing them in a bit. The questions we are going to look at tonight: will there be war with Iran? What is the reality of Iran's nuclear ambition? What impact does the Iranian democracy movement have? And what would an attack on Iran mean for the Middle East and for the United States and for the world? All of these questions and more tonight in our Issues and Dialogue presentation. Obama's Challenge, Iran, Nuclear War, and the Fate of the Middle East. Following Mr. Erlich's speech, Reese Erlich, sitting here to my left, we will have a panel discussion and a Q&A with you, the audience. As always, we remind you that civility must transcend our political and personal differences, so please, it's another way of saying please be nice. Let's be nice to each other and try to learn about this subject. It's a very important subject. Reese Erlich is the author. Well, let me just say who the panel is. They're sitting here, so you might as well know who they are. There's a sign. There are signs here to help you know. We have Larry Greenfield. He's a fellow at the Claremont Institute, where he writes and lectures on national security issues. He is also the executive director of the Reagan Legacy Foundation. Greenfield is a member of the California Republican Party Executive Committee and a former director of the Republican Jewish Coalition. He recently lectured on missile defense and the threat of Iranian proliferation at the Jerusalem Conference in Israel. Mr. Greenfield earned his BA from UC Berkeley in 3 years. Is that right, Larry? Yes. And his law degree from the Georgetown University Law Center.
They were going to throw me out anyways.
Sitting next to him is Christopher Records. He's a fourth-year history major at UC Riverside. And if you're a student here, you've probably been reading his commentaries. You've been writing for 4 years in the Highlander. On a whole variety of subjects, he's the opinions editor of the Highlander newspaper. And I'm going to do introductions for the second part of the event tonight, so we'll go into these a little more deeply. And then Scott Horton, at the end of the line there, the last but certainly not the least, is the host of anti-war radio for Chaos Radio 95.9 FM in Austin, Texas, and at antiwar.com, where he's also assistant editor. Horton, a libertarian, has conducted over 900 interviews with journalists, politicians, pundits, lawyers, and experts on foreign policy and wartime law. His guests have included Ron Paul, Ray McGovern, Daniel Ellsberg, Russell Means, Pat Buchanan, Noam Chomsky, Lou Rockwell, and it's a long list that's over 900 names long, so we won't go into that fully. He won the Austin Chronicle's Best of Austin Award and Best Iraq War Insight and Play-by-Play for anti-war radio in 2007. In 2004, Scott Horton served as foreign policy advisor to Libertarian Party presidential candidate Michael Badnarik. Is that pronounced correct? Thank you. Okay. All right. Reese Erlich is the author of the books The Iran Agenda, The Real Story of U.S. Policy in the Middle East Crisis, Target Iraq, What the News Media Didn't Tell You, and Dateline Havana, The Real Story of U.S. Policy and the Future of Cuba. He also produced an award-winning national one-hour public radio documentary, The Struggle for Iran. So he's been looking into Iran for quite some time. In June of 2009, Reese Erlich was an eyewitness to history covering the Iranian elections when over an estimated 1 million pro-democracy demonstrators marched through the streets of Iran. Previously, Reese Erlich had traveled to Iran with the actor Sean Penn, Academy Award winner. Erlich's photos accompanied Penn's 5-part series about the trip that appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle and later appeared in an A&E biography of Penn. Reese's history in journalism goes back 42 years, beginning at Ramparts in San Francisco, followed by a stint teaching journalism at Bay Area universities for 10 years. Erlich is a Peabody Award-winning broadcaster. He produced a number of radio documentaries, all hosted by Walter Cronkite, the legendary CBS News anchor. His documentary Children of War was hosted by NPR and PBS's Charlene Hunter-Gault. He reports regularly for a variety of radio networks, including NPR, CBC, ABC Australia, Radio Deutsche Welle in Germany, as well as KQED Radio News and the California Report. Erlich's newspaper articles have appeared in numerous papers in the United States and around the world, including the Christian Science Monitor, the San Francisco Chronicle, St. Petersburg Times, New York Times Syndicate, Dallas Morning News, and the Chicago Tribune. Mr. Erlich's will be available after the presentation tonight to autograph his books, and also the panelists will be available for a meet and greet. You can talk to people, tell them you like or dislike them or whatever. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Reese Erlich.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Lewis and the KUCR Radio and Highlander newspaper for making this event possible. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, the panel, and your questions. On June 12th of last year, I was in Iran covering the elections and had been out covering rallies and campaign events. I interviewed the supporters of Ahmadinejad, of Mr. Mousavi, the main reformist candidate, and I went to bed along with other people in Iran the night. It was a Friday night, very excited about the momentum that had been carrying forward the reformist forces. And I woke up Saturday morning, got online immediately, and found out that Ahmadinejad had won by 62%, according to the official figures. Now, from somebody who had covered the election, I was shocked, and the people of Iran were shocked. I went out onto the streets, and people said it was a coup d'etat, that it was impossible that that many votes, they expected at least for there to be a runoff between Mousavi and Ahmadinejad. Subsequently, I got piecemeal information at the time about vote fraud, but in the subsequent months, more people came forward. And essentially what happened was the word went out from the top that Ahmadinejad has to win at all costs. But it was a decentralized effort. It wasn't like they miscalculated the votes at the very top. The word went out down to the precinct level, or the equivalent. And so what happened was the Revolutionary Guard, which is the main military force in Iran, and the Basiji, which are these right-wing religious militia under the control of the Revolutionary Guard, stacked the ballot boxes. They would take old people into the booth, and regardless of who they wanted to vote for, made sure they voted for Ahmadinejad. In the areas where the where the reformists were likely to win, those ballots never made it to the counting area. So there was just, and that went on around the country systematically, and the result was it was probably even more rigged than they had planned. Because if he had just won by 51% of the vote, there wouldn't have been as much of the anger. But when it went all the way up to 62%, people were outraged. So in the coming days, in the days afterwards, the demonstrations began spontaneously. They were not called for by the reformist candidates, but they marched in the street, "Where is my vote?" And at one time there was perhaps as many as 1 million people marching through the streets of Tehran and in other cities around Iran silently. A huge, massive protest that was shaking the government to the core because they had not expected this kind of a reaction. And after a week, the government declared that the gloves are off. There's no more Mr. Nice Guy. They're not going to tolerate the demonstrations. The election is a done deal. And there had been repression up until then, but it got very serious at that point with people being shot. The famous Neda, the person who wasn't even demonstrating, was killed by one of the Basiji gunmen. Somewhere over 100 people were killed in the subsequent months and demonstrations. And what happened, what began as a movement strictly around the vote fraud, quickly expanded because people's pent-up anger with the problems in Iran came exploding forth. And all kinds of things from the wealthy people and their children who, if you're a mixed couple, if you're a boy and a girl, you can't hold hands together in a park or you're subject to fine or arrest, all the way to workers who hadn't been paid in months and were suffering under extremely high inflation. It hit in like 25% at one point. And all of this anger swelled into the streets. And the people, the initial core of mainly well-to-do Iranians in the initial demonstration swelled so that you can tell by how people dress. So the wealthy have, first of all, they drive nice cars, they've got designer sunglasses and designer clothes. But the demonstrations then started having clerics in their clerical robes, women wearing chadors dressed very conservatively, people from South Tehran, which is the working class neighborhoods. Anytime you can make a mental note for yourself, when you see an Iranian on a motorcycle or motorbike, he's probably from the working class because he can't afford a big car. And a lot of those folks were coming out. So it became a huge multi-class and very angry movement against the government itself. And it kind of went in two directions. Some people wanted to see reform within the existing Iranian system for keeping the Islamic constitution, which gives a prominent role to the clergy and the role of Islam in the government, and others, but they said it's been distorted and we need genuine democracy within the Islamic system. And then other people said, no, the problem is the system as a whole. We have to get rid of the Constitution, go back to a parliamentary system, something like we had before 1953. And, it's interesting, there are people in the United States who say the United States has to bring democracy to Iran or help promote democracy in Iran. Well, the Iranians are pretty suspicious when they hear that because they had some experience with that in the past. In 1953, Iran had democracy. It had civil society. It had free labor unions, free religious association, free newspapers, a parliamentary competitive system with competitive parties, and they voted democratically to nationalize British oil because British oil had been ripping off Iran for decades. And when that happened, the British and then the CIA came in and overthrew that democratic government and installed a dictatorship from basically picked by the United States, the Shah or the king. So when the United States talks about promoting or supporting democracy in Iran, it rings very hollow because every Iranian knows about that history from 1953. Now, as the demonstrations continued, it was very interesting. Several things happened. I, like all other reporters, had to leave Iran because our journalist visas expired. The government was not extending them. And reporters who could stay were restricted to their office. They were not allowed to go out and interview people and do their normal reporting. So, out of desperation, reporters, and this was true for the BBC and CNN and Fox and everybody, they turned to the internet and they found videos on YouTube or still photos. They got email messages, they got Twitter, went to Facebook, and started gathering information from actually a fairly narrow group of Iranians, but it's all they could get. And soon the notion came out that this was a Twitter revolution. Remember, you've all heard that expression, right? That Iran is the Twitter revolution. It's not, and it's actually a very misleading phrase. I wrote a commentary for Reuters where I explained this at greater length, but basically, first of all, most people in Iran don't have access to Twitter. They simply don't. And I didn't meet a single person in Iran who had Twitter, but I'll grant that there were some, but a very small number. And actually, you know how most of the demonstrations were organized? Text messaging. Use a cell phone and you send a text message. But text messaging revolution just doesn't have the same panache to it, right? So, and also, cell phones and text messaging is available to large numbers of Iranians, whether they're working class or upper class. Whereas the Twitter stuff was very much the elite that I described before, sincere, honest people. I'm not putting them down, but a very small percentage of the Iranian population. And by calling it a Twitter revolution and spinning it in a certain way, you get the impression that the people of Iran are rising up against their government to have some kind of a pro-U.S. government. And that's couldn't be farther from the truth. The reformist leadership, to the people in the street, want an independent Iran. And when it comes to all the issues that the United States raises, they pretty much are also in opposition to what the U.S. is saying about Iran. So the popular movement, the democratic movement, if they could have actually genuine free elections in Iran, they would definitely change how the country is run. They would favor civil liberties, greater liberties for women, for workers, et cetera, et cetera. But they're not going to budge on the key issues raised by the United States makes a big issue about. And that takes me to the next point I want to make, which is let's take a look at what U.S. policy has been and how it actually runs counter to what the people in Iran themselves are asking for. I had to chuckle that one conservative columnist by the name of Larry Elder claimed that the people of Iran were finally rising up against Islamofascism. And I had to chuckle because in all my trips to Iran, I've never heard anybody use that term. That's strictly a term used by some folks in this country to inaccurately describe what's going on. Frankly, most of the people in Iran were marching to have a more democratic Islamic government, not some kind of a U.S.-imposed version of opposing so-called Islamofascism. Briefly, the Bush administration significantly cranked up the pressure on Iran, and by the fall of 2007, I'm convinced, and I've written, that they were preparing to make a strike on the nuclear facilities in Iran. And the argument was Iran is about to or close to developing a nuclear weapon. It could be used against Israel or against U.S. troops in the area. Something must be done to stop this, and sanctions haven't worked, so the only alternative is a military strike. And a similar argument was made in Israel by the leadership of Israel. And they prepared for war, or not for outside. It's not like an Iraq war situation where you bomb and invade and occupy, but to hit the nuclear facilities, to use some U.S. troops to go in and make sure those facilities are actually out, to attack Revolutionary Guard bases and camps. And there was a leak to Seymour Hersh and later to the New York Times that detailed the actual plans that the Pentagon had, or was, I'm not saying they implemented them, but these were the functioning operational plans. And it would have been a disaster. It would have been a disaster. And when the U.S. went out, the Bush administration went out to try and get support for this in Europe, they couldn't find a single ally, including the British, who had, of course, backed the United States and everything that it had done to date. There was popular opposition inside the United States, and there was even significant opposition within the CIA and within the Pentagon. And that may have been the final straw. And that's precisely when, in December of 2007, the National Intelligence Estimate was issued, in which it said Iran has no nuclear weapons program. It claimed that it used to have one, but it doesn't have one currently. And that's, as of today, still the position of the United States, although there's a lot of rumors and press leaks about it, that's going to be changed or whatever. But the CIA, NSC, and the top intelligence agencies of the United States says that Iran has no nuclear weapons program. Yet everybody in the United States is convinced that it's a nuclear danger. Keep in mind that the original nuclear power program was not something that Iran did on its own. It was sold to the Iranians by the United States. The United States nuclear power companies, Westinghouse and others, were going to sell along with Europeans, a total of 10 nuclear power plants to the Shah of Iran in the 1970s. Why? Because Iran was going to be running out of other forms of fuel and needed nuclear power to generate electricity. The same exact argument, by the way, that the current government in Iran makes, and they've got less oil and natural gas than they used to back in the 1970s. So the argument that was accepted by Kissinger and Ford and Nixon and all the presidents of that era, Republicans I might add, suddenly that argument is no longer valid today. Iran, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has inspectors on the ground in Iran. They have raised questions about lack of transparency. They say they have questions about certain documents, raised doubts of one kind or another, but at no time has the IAEA ever said Iran has a nuclear weapons program. That's important, because there's one thing to say we're not sure and we need more information, and another thing to say it does have a program. And keep in mind that even if Iran had a nuclear weapons program and was able to enrich uranium to the level needed for a bomb, you need to figure out how to make the bomb work. You can't just like stick a fuse in it and light it and go run away with your ears covered, you know. It's very complicated technically to develop a bomb. And then once you have a bomb, you have to figure out how to put it on a nose cone of a missile to make it actually arrive somewhere. So they are, even if they were today vigorously working on such a program, which they're not, which nobody has shown that they are, it would still be many, many years away before they had an actionable atomic weapon. And then what would they have? They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 atomic bombs that could be easily hit by the U.S. or Israel, and might act as a deterrent, but certainly would not be any kind of an offensive weapon. Now, the argument is that Iran is an existential threat to Israel, that it's anti-Semitic, it's anti-Jewish, it wants to kill the Jews, and that the mad mullahs in Iran would launch, once they have an atomic weapon, they would launch an atomic weapon on Israel and causing horrible destruction, and we can't possibly let that happen. So therefore, either the United States or Israel has to go and bomb those nuclear facilities to protect the Jewish people. Well, if Iran was in fact that kind of a crazy society, why hasn't Iran already attacked Israel with conventional weapons? They have missiles, they have planes, they could get through the defenses, they could wreak a lot of damage inside Israel. But they haven't. Why? Because they're not crazy. They understand that any attack like that would immediately be, first of all, it would completely isolate them in the world. They would have no political support. Secondly, it would allow Israel and the United States to come in and flatten Iran and kill as many of the leaders as they could and destroy the Iranian society and have support of the UN and everybody else on it. And they are not crazy. And you don't have to take my word for it. Ehud Barak spoke before the Washington Institute for Near East Policy in February, and he said, and this is acknowledged now, it's finally being acknowledged by the Israeli leadership, the Iranian leaders may be radical, but they're not mashugana. Now, mashugana, you may know, is a Farsi word. My Iranian friends are going, what? Mashugana is Yiddish for crazy. So the Israeli government knows that Iran is not crazy. So, and they frankly, they know that Iran is not going to launch an offensive attack on Israel, and that they hype the issue of the nuclear weapons, as some in the United States, for precisely the same reason that weapons of mass destruction were hyped in Iraq, which is first you have a policy and then you hunt around for the excuse that will scare people the most. And then you focus in on that one and you say, aha, that's why we have to carry this action, even though it's made up out of whole cloth. So in the case of Iraq, oh my God, he's going to give terrorists suitcase atomic bombs to bring and explode in airports in America. We've got to, well, you can't let a madman like that stay in power. We've got to invade. Whoops. Oh, he didn't have the weapons of mass destruction. Ah, it doesn't matter. He was a bad guy anyway. I mean, am I exaggerating? I mean, that's the gist of the justification for the Iraq War. So today in Iran, we're seeing the same thing, except we can stop it now, ahead of time, because there is no weapons program in Iran. They are not a threat to Israel in the sense of an offensive military strike. Are they, what Israel, in reality, and actually Barak admitted this in the course of that other speech, is that what the real reason is that Israel worries about Iran's support for Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Palestine. They supply money to Hamas, they supply arms and money to Hezbollah. And Israel feels under threat from those organizations, from those parties. And, but unfortunately, even if Iran didn't exist at all, or there was a significant change in the government there and they stopped all support to those groups would not go away. It's the old outside agitator theory, which is that the people here at home are okay. They're not upset. It's those outside agitators that are funding them and provoking them to do these evil things. Hamas and Hezbollah are indigenous groups. I don't agree with them. I don't agree with them ideologically, but they are indigenous groups with popular bases in their countries that are not going to go away if Iran disappears tomorrow. Israel has to deal with the issue of resolving a two-state solution with the Israelis and Palestinians if it's going to deal with the, and not blame Iran for those problems. Now, the Obama administration came into power and made a tactical shift from what Bush had done. It emphasized negotiations. It stopped talking about bombing Iran and made a number of offers about the nuclear program and so on. And unfortunately, though, it was strictly a tactical switch because it didn't shift any of the basic demands the United States has been making on Iran under Republicans and Democrats for many years. And the threat was if Iran didn't go along with it, they would impose crippling sanctions. So as recently, basically starting at the beginning of this year, they've now shifted back again to a much more belligerent tone towards Iran. We start seeing more leaks from the Pentagon and the CIA about possible military strikes, what would happen if Israel attacked Iran without U.S. permission, which I don't think could happen, but that kind of speculation, and trying to get Russia and China to go along with crippling sanction, which, by the way, hurt the people of Iran, not the Iranian leadership. They've tried various kinds of sanctions against the Iranian leadership. They don't work. And when they crank up the sanctions to a higher level, they inevitably hurt Iranians. And so when I went out and talked to ordinary Iranians in the Green Movement, remember, these are the people who are fighting for democracy, which I think have all of our sympathy. They are opposed to sanctions from the United States. They're not only opposed to increasing the sanctions, they're for rolling back the existing sanctions. Because all it does is give the government in Iran the excuse to say, aha, you people fighting for democracy are allied with the United States, and they support your movement, you're trying to overthrow us, so that justifies us. And they try to rally people around the government because of what the United States is doing. And unfortunately, Obama now, in my view, is adopting pretty much a similar policy to what the later years of the Bush administration did on it when it comes to Iran. I think it's foolhardy, it's a mistake, it has the opposite effect, especially when it comes to a country like Iran where there is a popular movement, where there's an alternative. I'm not claiming that they're going to come to power tomorrow. There's ups and downs in the movement. Right now it's a bit of an ebb because of a tremendous repression, but that's not going to be the end of it. It is going to rise up again. The anger is there. And they're not going to rise up and install a pro-U.S. government. They're going to rise up and install an Iranian government that looks after their own interests. I don't think they will carry out some of the aggressive foreign policies that Ahmadinejad has. And I make no doubt about it, I am a strong critic of Ahmadinejad's domestic and his foreign policies. He tries to use, basically he's a right-wing nationalist. And in that sense, think of in World War II, the Japanese militarists said, yellow people have to join together to kick out the foreign imperialists. They were anti-imperialists against the British and the Dutch and the French, and they came into the colonies, to their former colonies, and imposed a worse system than what the European colonialists had done. So Ahmadinejad is saying, join with me, Muslims, against the American Yankee imperialists. We're part of a worldwide Muslim anti-imperialist crusade. But meanwhile, the system that he would impose that would replace that of the United States is as bad or worse than what the U.S. is doing, just as the analogy. He doesn't have the power of the Japanese militarists, so not in that sense. But ideologically, he's doing the same kind of thing. And he wants, I think the reformists, if they come to power, would back off on all of these efforts to lead the Muslim world, which he's trying to do. They would focus on solving Iran's very real problems. I think they would sit down to negotiate with the United States, but on all these issues, they're still going to want nuclear power. They're still going to want control of their oil resources. They're not going to suddenly open up the floodgates to U.S. Oil companies. You know, there's a whole series of things that are not going to maintain Iranian sovereignty, and we should understand that. But I think the best thing the United States can do at this time is to stop take the military option off the table, to not only not increase the sanctions, but roll back the sanctions, to acknowledge that the people of Iran themselves have to resolve their own problems, and it's not the United States to to go around the world trying to impose its will willy-nilly around the world. And I think if we do that, we'll see a significant change in U.S. policy and a far better Iran. Thank you very much.
Before we get to the panel, the next segment will be a panel, and each panelist will have about a 5-minute statement, and then there'll be an exchange between the panelists, and then there'll be a Q&A with you, in which my colleague Joe Totten will walk around Oprah Winfrey style with this microphone. So you've heard Reese Erlich, and I think everyone's just aching to know what Sean Penn is really like. We'll get to that maybe after the presentation. But we're going to hear a different point of view now. We're going to hear from Larry Greenfield. Again, he's a fellow at the Claremont Institute, which is conveniently located in Claremont. Is that correct, Larry? Yes, that's what I thought. Where he writes and lectures on national security issues. He's also the executive director of the Reagan Legacy Foundation. Greenfield is a member of the California Republican Party Executive Committee and a former director of the Republican Jewish Coalition. He recently lectured on missile defense and the threat of Iranian proliferation at the Jerusalem Conference in Israel. And please welcome Larry Greenfield.
Sure.
Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for including me in the program tonight. I only have 5 minutes, so I'll save a lot for Q&A. Let's start where we agree. First, although there were many voices which opposed America's response to Nazi Germany or Japanese imperialism or international communism, many of them defended Stalin, for example. And of course, history showed he murdered 40, 60, 80 million people. At least now, I feel that some reality has set in among the anti-war or political left, which does label Ahmadinejad and the mullahs and the tyranny of radical Islam and the oppression of women and Sharia law courts in London. If a lady wants to get a divorce now in London and her husband is Muslim, she no longer has the protection of civil law, of common law courts. He can have abused her. She can't have testimony in that court. There seems to be some honesty and reality about the threat of this mullah tyranny in Iran. So I'm grateful for that. The domestic oppression, we all saw it on television, on the internet, on the cell phones. The treatment of women, the international criminal conspiracy, which is the Iranian government. I've got articles which talk about now the hijacking, the grabbing of Kurdish and Baluchi resistors to the Iranian regime in countries in Europe. They're not afraid, the Iranians, to threaten and attack broadcasters in Los Angeles who are trying to work with the dissidents in Iran. So you've got a very vicious regime. The terrorism, of course, does exist. I wildly disagree with the statement that Iran is not assaulting Israel. They are, of course. They're funding and training Hezbollah and Hamas. They are all inspired by, trained by, funded by the Iranian regime. We know about the genocidal threats from the Iranian regime, the claims there was no Holocaust, the threats to annihilate the state of Israel, death to America. What you've got in Iran is an Islamic republic since 1979 that's been at war with the United States and the West, with Christians, with Jews, of course with many, many Muslims. Moderate Muslims, dissident Muslims, reformist Muslims are the biggest victims of radical Islam, of the jihad. The Saudis are a big source of this Wahhabi threat in mosques and madrasas, the treatment of these kids around the world, and of course the Iranians, which are not Arab, are a big source too. The Americans tend to underestimate the threats that build up. We underestimated the threats in Libya, in Pakistan. in North Korea. Many are just now learning about the threats from EMP. You can simply launch a missile, and Iran, of course, has been working on their delivery systems. They admit, of course, and reveal. We all watch the delivery systems, the missiles that are in the air. If they launch one over a Western capital, once it's 100 kilometers or more in the air, they don't have to even particularly target it. EMP, electromagnetic pulse, means it'll shut down our cars, our computers, our electronics. They've stated their military policy. They'd like to have the capability to do that. By the way, they don't even have to use this stuff. The mere threat of nuclear or chemical or biological threats means that it is an umbrella under which they can act to fund terror groups, Al-Qaeda and others, or others that work with them, Hezbollah, Hamas. It intimidates the Sunni Arab states. I am told by many experts that the Sunni states are very concerned about the Shiite regime in Iran and their hegemonic impulse to take over parts of the Middle East, to intimidate, to push their ideology. I take a little bit of exception at the twice repeated words right wing. I don't consider it right wing to be an Islamist radical tyranny. I consider that left wing, or at least their allies tend to be left wing, not right wing. By the way, Sarkozy in France has moved far to the right of President Obama. The European leaders in particular were deeply concerned and impressed by the treatment of the kids in the streets in Iran, in Tehran, in June 12th. America's actually lagging now the energy in foreign capitals concerned about Ahmadinejad. Let me just outline in my last minute, if I have. Okay, in my last minute, I think there are 4 policy options for the Obama administration. More engagement and concessions to the regime. Barack Obama has offered pleasant notes of greeting last year and this year during the time of Iranian New Year. I think that policy is an absolute disaster. It's collapsed. Iran has come out repeatedly, the head of Iran's Atomic Energy Agency. This is no conspiracy. Iran admits they have a nuclear weapons program, they have delivery system programs, they say we want to have the program, we have the right to the program, they threaten. This is not an American imagination. The engagement policy doesn't seem to have worked. Number 2, containment of a nuclear-armed Iran. That doesn't seem to have worked. Many American policymakers repeat statements such as, at least with the Russians, they were radical but rational. The Mahdaists in Iran say we'll gladly sacrifice many millions of our own citizens for a nuclear exchange with America or with Israel. There are 72 virgins waiting for us in heaven. This is a real radical fundamentalist religious sect. So we need to understand we can't necessarily contain them. Number 3 would be regime change, which maybe was more likely. I am the biggest fan of supporting the dissidents and the reformers and the different types of people, the Baluchis, the Kurds, the domestic opposition, the students. We lost a year. Charles Krauthammer wrote, the year of regime change was last year, but we looked away. Do you know that there's graffiti now in Iran, in Tehran, Obama, Obama, are you with us or with the tyranny? That is pretty sad. For 60 years from Truman on, bipartisan, most American presidents tried to stand, at least rhetorically, by dissidents, by freedom fighters. And finally, the question of military strikes to eliminate the nuclear threat and signal resolve to America's friends and enemies. Very complicated. I'd be the first one to offer caution. These are prudential questions. Can it work? What would be the response in Iran by the domestic population? I would say, at the risk of controversy and causing upset and disunity here, as much as the Iraq War was controversial, and I agree some of the claims were misstated, although Iraq did use chemical weapons against the Kurds, Iraq did actually cause the cleft palates among the children of women today in Iraq. But take away that WMD argument. Ask the Iraqi people today, who vote repeatedly and over, are you better off now than you were 4, 8, 10 years ago? And yes, we sided with Saddam Hussein against Iran. But now, prudentially, is Iraq better? Are we better that we planted seeds of democracy in the Arab world? Do kids now go to school in Afghanistan, a site of another American war? By the way, I noticed we didn't grab the oil out of Iraq. The Iraqis have their oil. Oil's over $80. So we disagree on a lot of analysis about the motives and the methods of American foreign policy. I'm glad we agree the Ahmadinejad regime is at least brutal to its own people. I've tried to outline some options for American policy. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Larry. Let's go now to Christopher Records, opinions editor of the Highlander newspaper here at UC Riverside.
Thank you very much. I think it's good to have discussions about Iran, especially in light of the fact that many people, the majority of this country, have really no idea about the political situation in Iran and what distinguishes it from its neighbors, Iraq and Afghanistan, where we're both involved right now. And it's also helpful because of the demonization that's gone on over the past 30 years, ever since the Iranian Revolution, where we've come to see Iran sort of as the antithesis of everything American, and all of their activities as necessarily evil and necessarily sinister. So it's important that we look at Iran in its own context and within its own indigenous political system. There's a tendency to view Iran as a unique situation, as a worst, as a sort of the most negative force in the world. But as we've seen, obviously, the United States does not go to war with or does not demonize all countries that are not liberal democracies, nor does it offer its support only to liberal democracies. So definitely we need to talk about it. Also, I think there's a definite movement in this country to move away from war and from hostility, especially in the Middle East, in the aftermath of Afghanistan and Iraq, especially among Americans of military age, because we've grown up with those two wars and we've seen the results of violent U.S. action in the Middle East and how these have not facilitated anything productive, either in the way of our own interests or in the interests of democracy. In Iraq, obviously, situation in regards to human rights is debatable, but I think one can compare what went on with Saddam and what has occurred since 2003 and definitely state that many people within Iraq would not agree that things have improved for them. So that's sort of my position.
Thank you. Thank you, Christopher. All right, let's now go to Scott Horton. He is the host of Anti-War Radio for KS Radio 95.9 FM in Austin, and he's the assistant editor and the host of Anti-War Radio at antiwar.com. Horton, a libertarian, has conducted over 900 interviews with journalists, politicians, pundits, lawyers, and experts on foreign policy and wartime law. We had listed the number of the guests previously. Horton won Austin Chronicle's Best of Austin Award, the Best Iraq War Insight and Play-by-Play for Anti-War Radio in 2007, and in 2004, Horton served as foreign policy advisor to Libertarian presidential candidate Michael Bednarik. Please welcome Scott Horton.
Thank you, Louis. Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. Well, to try to be brief here, the war party in America is depending on your ignorance. They figure that you don't know anything about Iran and that you don't know anything about nuclear technology. And so if they say to you nuclear and scary a few times in a row, you'll fall for it. Fellow panelists just said that the Iranians have admitted that they have a nuclear weapons program, that they're making nuclear weapons. Well, that couldn't be further from the truth. They've denied that they're seeking nuclear weapons over and over again, and their supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, has issued a fatwa saying it would be unpardonable religious offense to pursue nuclear weapons, which are not allowed under Islam, according to him, because they cannot be used without killing innocent people in an indiscriminate fashion. So maybe he's a liar, and maybe that's a deceit, but they certainly have not declared that they're making nuclear weapons. What they have is a civilian nuclear program, which is safeguarded by the IAEA under their Safeguards Agreement. Any non-nuclear weapon state, such as Iran, which is a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, must have a Safeguards Agreement with the IAEA, which allows the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors to monitor their nuclear facilities and verify the non-diversion, as the IAEA has in the case of the Iranians more than a dozen times over the years, including just late last year. They have continued to verify the non-diversion of any nuclear material to a military or other special purpose. So what they're basically saying to you is, we have proved the negative. We have proved what they have not done. They have not diverted any of their nuclear material away. Now, to make a uranium atom bomb is actually relatively easy, assuming that you have the uranium enriched above 90% uranium-235 and that you have a couple of 100 pounds of it. The Americans didn't test the bomb that they dropped on Hiroshima. It was a simple gun-type nuke. You slam two pieces of highly enriched uranium together, they go off. They had to test the much more complicated plutonium implosion bomb that was used on Nagasaki. Well, nobody's accusing the Iranians of producing plutonium or having any plutonium. They're being accused of enriching uranium, but they're enriching uranium to a measly 3.6% industrial grade for use in their electricity program. And then beginning only a couple of weeks ago, when after they accepted Obama's proposal, he refused to accept their acceptance of it, they went ahead and began to enrich a very small amount of this uranium to 20% uranium-235, which still is a far sight from weapons-grade uranium, and it's to be used in their American-built medical isotope reactor in Tehran. However, if you turn it to ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox News, or any of the rest of them, the Fox guys and David Schuster over at the liberal channel, MSNBC, will all agree that there's a scary, dangerous nuclear weapons threat from Iran. And they just figure, you don't know about a Safeguards Agreement, you don't know about the Non-Proliferation Treaty, you don't know the difference between 3.6% and 90+% uranium-235, and therefore, if you're afraid of getting nuked in your jammies in the middle of the night, you'll let them go ahead and have their war. The problem is, the ones who are ignorant and mistakenly pass on bad information, that is what it is. There are also people who are outright liars. And if you take somebody who is a CNN or an NBC or a Fox News reporter who tells you that the Iranians have a nuclear weapons program, that is unforgivable ignorance on the part of somebody who's supposedly telling you the news. Another thing I would like to mention, or try to hit off of something that Mr. Erlich said in his talk there, is that a war with Iran would be a disaster. That's the way he put it. The way I put it is that a war with Iran would mean the deaths of thousands of American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. 4,000 soldiers have died in the Iraq War in order to install the Iranians' puppets from the Dawa Party, the Mahdi Army, and the Supreme Islamic Council in power in Baghdad. And both Abdulaziz al-Hakim from the Supreme Islamic Council, who's now dead, but his son is in charge, and Muqtada al-Sadr, the big kingmaker from the election a couple of weeks ago, have promised that they would go to war with the American occupation in the United States. These are the people who did not fight. These are the people who gained when America overthrew Saddam Hussein and have waited this whole time. And they have said, if you bomb Iran, you're going to have to start the war with us all over again. not to mention the fact that our soldiers are right there within missile range. It is also perfectly within the capability of the Iranians to close the Straits of Hormuz at the gates of the Persian Gulf and drive the cost of oil up over $200 a barrel, which would probably destroy what's left of the global economy and the division of labor in global trade. And all for basically a policy that comes out of Tel Aviv, because the Likud party, Benjamin Netanyahu and his associates, are paranoids. And to them, if the Iranians have nuclear technology, full stop, that's it, that is tantamount, that is equivalent to them having nuclear weapons and being ready to use them on us at any moment, and therefore that's an existential threat and it's intolerable. And yet it's 6 degrees of reality away from the real situation. And if American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan and American sailors in the Persian Gulf die because of an Israeli and/or American war against Iran over a nuclear weapons program that doesn't exist, there's going to be hell to pay by somebody.
Thank you very much, Scott Horton. All right, Larry Greenfield, and if you could please leave my microphone up, Daniel. Larry Greenfield, do you have a question? There's a lot to talk about here, a lot of content. Larry, do you have a question for Reese?
Yes, I do. It sort of builds on the previous comment. Since I did wear the uniform and I am one of those U.S. sailors, I don't know exactly who you were threatening with that comment, but the hell to pay to me seems to be what is threatened. Reese, are you aware of the following 2 or 3 quotes? Israel should be wiped off the map. They are like cattle, nay, more misguided. Next to them, all the criminals of the world seem righteous. The germ of corruption will be wiped off the face of the world. By the way, these are all violations of the genocide conventions and treaties. You're not allowed to threaten the genocide of a people. Beside death to America, and, by the way, the admitting by the Iranians, and I have the quote from the head of the IAEA in Iran, the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization, that they're going to be building new plants that will be inside of mountains. This is, sorry for the long question. This is after Iran denied for 2 decades their weapons program, their delivery system program, their weaponization programs. Do you agree that there is threatening rhetoric, particularly interesting to threaten genocide against the people that went through a genocide, and that they've lied, the Iranian mullahs, and you're not a fan of Ahmadinejad, has lied about their weapons programs? They now release the information there was another facility at Qom, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, QOM. Do you agree that this is a threatening regime that has hidden and lied their weapons programs?
Reese Erlich.
Yes, I do recognize those quotes. Ahmadinejad, I have to say this. The most common quote that's often thrown around is that we are going to wipe Israel off the map. But if you actually do a translation from well, 2 things about it. First of all, it's a slogan that's been around since the early days of the Iranian Revolution. Khomeini popularized it. It was not something that Ahmadinejad himself came up with. And what it really means is the Zionist entity will vanish from the pages, over the pages of time, which is hardly saying that we are going to wipe out Israelis. So the quotes are consciously mistranslated, misinterpreted in order to make Ahmadinejad sound like he's an immediate threat to the Jewish people. The question of the I agree with what Scott said before. Iran has never said they have a nuclear weapons program. What he said, the atomic energy head in Iran said, is that they have nuclear enrichment facilities scattered around Iran for the peaceful development of nuclear energy. That they've never ever said they're developing nuclear weapons.
If I may,
Well,
just one
sure.
gentle...
No, but I didn't...
Well,
I didn't
okay,
interrupt you.
okay, Reese,
Actually,
Reese.
I wanted to say that
Of
one of
course.
the things I liked was
Okay,
you and I don't have often have a chance to exchange views, and I think I think it's very positive. But I'll speak, and you can speak.
Okay.
Okay? I didn't interrupt you.
I was trying a colloquy, but I'm happy to wait till you're done.
I have to say that in your initial statement, you said that Iran is a supporter and a funder of Al-Qaeda.
No, I said Hezbollah and Hamas.
No. You said Al-Qaeda
I didn't.
and the
I
groups
said
that...
Hezbollah and Hamas.
I'm writing it down, and we can check the tape.
Please.
Funds groups like Al-Qaeda and groups that work with them, like Hezbollah and Hamas.
No.
Okay. Well, you were in the audience. You heard it. That is... it is actually part of a common point made by Republicans and some high-level Democrats as well, that is so misleading and part of the process of terrifying people in this country. Hamas and Hezbollah have no ties whatsoever with Al-Qaeda. Iran has no ties whatsoever with Al-Qaeda. In fact, Iran denounced the 9/11 attacks. Iran almost went to war with Taliban when Al-Qaeda was still inside inside Afghanistan, because the Taliban had killed 11 Iranian diplomats. One is a Sunni group seeking, domination in the Muslim world. The other is a Shia group steadfastly opposed to them, and to lump them both together is scaremongering. It has nothing to do with reality, and it's the same. So, yeah, I think Iran is the Iranian government is a immediate danger to the people of Iran. There is no question about that. And they love to meddle in affairs, whether it's in Iraq or elsewhere. But it's not because they have a nuclear weapons program that threatens the United States or Israel, for that matter.
Quickly.
Yeah, two points very quickly. Everybody knows Iran is sitting on a lot of energy, right? Why do they need a nuclear program? I want to plant that seed for a second. It isn't because they're real interested in nuclear power, because they're environmentalists and they don't like fossil fuels. Okay, number two, you just made a great case against an argument I didn't make. I specifically said Hezbollah and Hamas. I've spent a lot of time on the ground in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. By the way, Hezbollah does include Shiites, and there is a big link between Hezbollah and Hamas and Iran. But just in case you still want to assume that I said Iran was linked to Al-Qaeda, I will stipulate Iran did hurt and attack Americans and American interests in Iraq. So they actually have literally gone to war with us, Iran. And so it isn't just funding the terrorists and training the terrorists in Hezbollah and Hamas against our allies Israel, but literally Iran has been working on attacks against American troops in the theater in Iraq.
All right, Christopher Records, do you have a question for our guest, Reese Erlich?
Yeah, I have an actual question. Given the fact that U.S. support for regimes in the Middle East, especially, the example that comes to my mind is in Palestine, how our support for the Palestinian Authority has encouraged popular support for Hamas and other opposing organizations. How should we support the Green Movement in Iran, either financially or with other means?
Okay. There was kind of two parts to that. I'll focus on the last part. There was a lot of debate within the Obama administration as to what to do and how to respond. And to its credit, the Obama administration understood if they came out foursquare in support of the movement, that could be used against the movement by the Iranian regime. So they downplayed it. They supported Iranian human rights, but in a very quiet way, which I think made sense at the time. I would say the U.S. should be fully supporting human rights in Iran through the UN, through other multilateral institutions, should lift the sanctions that prohibit the use of important software technology that the Iranian movement could be using, for example, things through software, through Microsoft and elsewhere that are currently blocked because of the sanctions. There are things that the U.S. could do that would facilitate the Iranian movement, but I think it's important not to be calling for a regime change or other things which are going to get which will be making it worse for the Green movement.
All right. Scott Horton, do you have a question for Reese Erlich?
Well, Mr. Greenfield brought up Iranian persecution of Baluchi minority resistance groups, and I was wondering if you could tell us anything about Jandala, and isn't that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the ringleader of the 9/11 attacks, former group?
Let's give the audience some background on... Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so the Baluchi people are an ethnic minority that live in Iran and also Pakistan. They're in the southeast part of Iran. They have their own language and culture. They tend to be Sunnis rather than Shia, and they have their own set of grievances against the government, as do all the ethnic minorities in Iran, the Kurds and others. There is a group, and I'm not sure, I'll ask Larry if this is the group you're referring to. There's a group called Jandala, which was supported by the United States, which engaged in armed activities inside Iran. Is that, when you're talking about the Baluchi, is that the specific group?
There's a range of Kurdish and Baluchi groups, and some are considered terrorist groups, and some are more freedom fighters, and so it's a spectrum.
Okay. The group that's most famous, Jandala, because it carried out bombings of Revolutionary Guard buses and it killed a lot of civilians as well, is, here comes that term again, a right-wing fundamentalist group that has its origins with the Taliban. And the U.S., in my book, I write about the fact that Jandala was armed and supported during the Bush administration years, a group that's carrying out terrorist attacks inside Iran.
Would that be this book?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Thank you. What a coincidence. Similarly, I was up in the Kurdish region of northern Iraq, and I interviewed all of the Kurdish guerrillas up there. There's one group that's currently carrying out armed struggle against Iran. It's called PJAK, the Party of Free Life. It's the sister organization of the PKK in Turkey, which is the group that the U.S. condemns as a terrorist group, but the U.S. was backing and arming the sister group of the PKK called the PJAK because they were attacking Iran. So, particularly under the Bush administration, some of it may still be going on, although I don't know if it's continuing under Obama. It was under the guise of supposedly helping ethnic minorities, was sponsoring terrorist groups because they were opposed to the central government. It's a very dangerous game to play, similar to what the U.S. did in backing the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. I opposed the invasion of the Soviet Union of Afghanistan, but we backed the folks who later evolved into Al-Qaeda.
Okay, go ahead and respond.
Actually, we didn't. There were 7 main groups that fought the Soviet genocide and invasion and brutalization of Afghanistan. The one we had close relationship with was the NIF, and that was Ahmed Shah Massoud, the Lion of the Panjshir Valley. That's the man who was murdered by the pretend cameraman the night before 9/11, because Al-Qaeda knew that we would have an ally in Afghanistan when we responded after 9/11 against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So there was one group in particular. We didn't support bin Laden. Bin Laden is an Arab who came in afterward. He was in Afghanistan before, but then he came back from Araby in 3 or 4 or 5 years later after we left Afghanistan, after the Soviets collapsed and withdrew. So it's another canard that we somehow sponsored or built up or funded or trained Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. It's not true. Al-Qaeda came into Afghanistan after the United States left. We shouldn't have left. We left a vacuum, and a terrible regime, the Taliban, was set up in Afghanistan, and they gave cover to the Taliban, which then attacked us.
But Iran and the Taliban are opposed strongly to each other.
Yeah, that's true. I agree with that.
Okay. In the next round of questions, we want to go through this quickly, as I want to open it up to the audience. But I'd like, Larry, you to ask any other, you can ask Reese or any other panelist a question.
Okay. I just want to raise one point, which is the NIE, the National Intelligence Estimate of 2007. Reese brought it up. It's widely discredited, not that there wasn't that NIE, but the way the media ran with it. They took one line out of a long report, which is, quote, Iran does not have nuclear weapons capability. But if you read the whole report, which I read, it said they have delivery systems and they're testing them, the missiles. It said they have centrifuges, thousands and thousands of them. Yes, spinning, and you're right, by the way, about your figures, from 3% to 20%, and you need 94% of the enriched uranium. But the part that it said is they haven't yet turned the warhead into a weapon, a live weapon. They haven't turned it into a live weapon. But you can do that in a matter of days or hours even. Does anyone believe that they don't have, after 60 years after atomic bombs were invented, the ability with former Soviet scientists and other there to turn it on when they want to? Of course they can. So my question for the panel, whoever wants to answer, is, do you admit, do you recognize that the media did quite a job with the 2007 NIE report? All of a sudden we're supposed to relax, but at any time Iran can go from non-nuclear power to nuclear power. They just weaponize the warhead.
Scott, go ahead.
I'd be happy to answer that.
Go ahead.
All right. Well, last September, Mark Hosenball reported in a web-only exclusive for Newsweek magazine that the CIA and, in fact, the rest of the intelligence community, including the other 16 American intelligence agencies that we know about, that they all agreed and put paperwork on President Obama's desk, a new report on his desk saying that they stand by their conclusion of November 2007, that the Iranians do not have a nuclear weapons program and they have not made the political decision to start one. After that, that was in September, then in November was the big hubbub about the facility at Cannes. When Barack Obama, Gordon Brown, and Nicholas Sarkozy did their big joint press conference and announced, we busted them. Well, in fact, they hadn't busted anything. All the Iranians had done was dug a hole in the ground, and then, capital D, quote-unquote, legal term, they declared their intention to the International Atomic Energy Agency that they are going to build a uranium enrichment centrifuge enrichment facility there someday. And it's going to be at least 6 months from now, and that's the rule in the IAEA Safeguards Agreement. 6 months before you introduce any nuclear material into the centrifuges, you have to let us know. Well, it's been almost 6 months already, and the facility is still just a hole in the ground, maybe a concrete wall or two. But it's hardly a secret atom bomb factory like it said on the cover of the New York Post. And then this was actually just linked to by Fox News. They, of course, claimed it said something the exact opposite of what it actually said, but you find the link from Fox News to the DNI report that the National Intelligence Director submitted to Congress covering all the time up through December 31st, 2009, the end of last year. And all they say about the COM facility is that, yeah, the Iranians declared that they're going to build a facility. Nothing about we caught them doing anything secret, not they were in violation of their safeguards agreement, nothing like that. And then in February, on February the 15th, the Director of National Intelligence, Dennis Blair, and I forget the gentleman's name, but he's the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, they both sat there sworn under oath before the U.S. Imperial Senate and said, we still stand by the conclusion of the unanimous intelligence National Intelligence Council, representatives of all 16 intelligence agencies from November of 2007. And that is, the Iranians have not made the decision to begin to make nuclear weapons. And no, the ability to take a couple of 100 pounds of uranium enriched to 3.6% 235 and turning that into above 90, 94% pure U-235 to making a weapon is not the same as flipping a light switch and taking one day. You're talking still about years and years. Plus, you got to have the metallurgist machine it into the actual pieces, and then you actually would have to have the, I'm not so certain about the terminology. People quibble, they do quibble about what's a delivery vehicle, what's a warhead. A warhead is the bomb. The delivery vehicle is what you put that in. Well, they don't have delivery vehicles and they don't have warheads, so I'm not sure how these things are supposed to hurt any of us. It's just nonsense. And by the way, one more thing, pardon me real quick. The only way that a nuclear bomb can turn off all of your lights in the country is if it is...
You're referring to the EMP here.
The EMP, right, the electromagnetic pulse. That is only enhanced radiation, over 100, at least tens and tens of megaton thermonuclear weapons. It was, they noticed when they were testing thermonukes over the Pacific that they would turn out the lights and destroy circuitry. First thing they did was harden every bit of military circuitry against that effect, so there goes that. But then the Russians, the Chinese, and the United States all pursued projects to figure out if they could make enhanced radiation weapons that would be able to set off, ionize the atmosphere in such a way that it would set off an electromagnetic pulse and destroy everybody's electrical equipment. But remember now, we're talking about lowest yield, maybe in the Iranians' greatest dream, a 10-kiloton simple fission uranium bomb. And if one of those can turn out your lights, it's about to cremate you. And so you don't need to worry about it turning off your lights.
Okay,
And it's just not true what Frank Gaffney and Newsmax say. They twist the words of some Senate report to make it sound like someone could destroy all electricity in America forever. I saw Frank Gaffney on TV saying 70% of the American people will starve to death. It'll be like chaos in the apocalypse if someone sets off one atom bomb anywhere near any of us. It's just not true.
Reese Erlich and then Larry Greenfield.
Larry asked, you should think about why do they need a nuclear weapons program when they have all this energy. Well, why did the Shah demand to get nuclear power from the United States and Germany in the 1970s? Because burning oil is actually a horrifically inefficient way to generate electricity. You want to sell your oil and have some other means, such as natural gas, to generate electricity. You make a lot more money that way. And oil runs out. Iranian oil is slowly running out, as it is in many other parts of the world. And it's a lot less oil in the ground today than there was in the 1970s when the U.S. and the Shah agreed Iran needed nuclear power. So I'm not a defender of nuclear power. I don't like nuclear power in the United States because I don't think we can deal with the waste. But if we assert the right to have nuclear power here, how can we deny it to another country that has its legitimate claims for the same reasons that when... The difference is, I guarantee you, if somehow the Shah came back tomorrow, or the Shah's son, this nuclear issue would disappear. There would be no more talk about nuclear weapons or anything else in Iran. I read the NIE, or at least the public version of it, and it says specifically that Iran does not have a nuclear weapons program. They claimed that it did earlier, but that it stopped in 2003, and that was included down to today. And that's, don't take either of our word for it. Google it online, read it for yourself.
Larry Greenfield.
Just very quickly, the IAEA had a report that just came out March 3rd, warning that continued nuclear activities in violation of UN resolutions raises concerns about the existence in Iran of past or current undisclosed activities related to the development of a nuclear payload for a missile. Then you had the CIA report called the 721 report, which talks about keeping open their options for building nuclear arms. During the first 11 months of last year, the main uranium enrichment facility at Natanz produced low-enriched uranium hexafluoride. The number of centrifuges at Natanz increased from 5,000 to 8,700 last year. Last year, Iran disclosed building its second gas centrifuge plant near the city of Qom that will house an estimated 3,000 machines. It's a clear sign that Iran's nuclear program is geared toward producing weapons because the facility is too small for non-military uranium enrichment. Iran also continued to work last year on a heavy water research reactor. Again, the only purpose for that is nuclear weapons. And finally, on the missiles, I'm not sure it was all over the news. Iran launched lots of missiles. They have the delivery systems. 3 tests of the new 1,240-mile range Sigil missile were conducted in 2009. Assistance from China, North Korea, and Russia helped move Iran towards self-sufficiency in the production of ballistic missiles. From my understanding, nobody doubts that Iran now has the missile capability to reach throughout the Middle East and now Europe and eventually all the West. North Korea does, and Iran will too.
Okay, quick response from Reese.
One sentence response. Having a missile that delivers conventional weapons is not the same thing as having a missile fitted with an atomic warhead. There's different technology. Iran does not have that technology.
Okay, Christopher Records, question for the panel.
I don't have so much of a question as sort of an observation. Just listening to you talk about sort of the evidence, enumerate the evidence, I was sort of reminded of 2002, 2003, uranium in Africa, the different little pieces.
The yellow cake you're referring to?
Yes. You can take anything in isolation and make it sound incriminating for various political purposes. But the fact remains that the IAEA has never said that Iran has nuclear weapons capability. To my knowledge, has not said that it's seeking nuclear weapons capability. So I don't really know whether that is compelling evidence for action or military action or whatever. So.
Okay.
So I'd be the first one to agree that policymakers should be very careful with intelligence. They should be very careful in making the case to the American people or Western societies before acting militarily, especially when it's based on controversial or unproved or difficult to find or multi-layered, analyzed weapons programs. I totally agree with that. I think the Bush administration erred to the extent that it oversold or misunderstood or didn't do a good job totally analyzing. By the way, I don't think it was completely their fault. The Democrats in Congress in the 90s, Bill Clinton supported regime change. Most of the intelligence agencies around the world said Iraq had WMD programs. They'd used chemical weapons against the Kurds and their own people. They did have a WMD program. We actually did find the Al-Tawatha missiles. We did find some plants and some things buried. But I admit, to the extent that everybody was scared that at the moment Saddam Hussein has WMD, I agree. But there were other reasons to liberate Iraqis and plant seeds of democracies in the Middle East. In just one sentence, there were human shredders and rape rooms. There were 17 violations of UN sanctions. There was human rights abuse. There was an enemy of the United States which attacked our interests. And I know before they'd been our allies, so to speak, in the Iran-Iraq war. And Rumsfeld did go to Iraq and side with Saddam. I understand all that. I think today Iraq is better off than it was under Saddam Hussein. I think Iran would be better off if there were regime change there. I'm not calling for missile strikes tonight from Israel or from the United States. But I would like there to be some foreign policy agreement that this is a threatening regime, a terrorist-sponsoring regime, brutal to its own people. It has lied all along about its capabilities and programs. That's enough for me to at least have a confrontive foreign policy and consider them sort of out of the range of legitimate states.
Okay, thank you. A question, comment from Scott Horton. And the last one, and then we're going to open it to the audience.
This is to anyone, or?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I guess I'd like to ask you, Mr. Greenfield. I don't think I heard you, by the way, saying that Iran was friends with Al-Qaeda specifically. I don't think I heard that, although I might have been spacing out. However, what you did do, though, was conflate all armed Muslims in the world together into one big Islamic extremism. And I'm thinking, if there really is, and never mind the fact that Ayman al-Zawahiri is the avowed enemy of the Ayatollah Khomeini, and never mind the fact that Osama bin Laden was the avowed enemy of Saddam Hussein and cheered when we overthrew him for him and all that. But I just wonder if you really do believe that there's such a danger from Islamic extremism as a motivation here, whether we're talking about Hamas, Hezbollah, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, Al-Qaeda, or the Ayatollah and his group of mullahs. wouldn't it behoove us to not conflate them all together, but in fact to try to isolate these groups and figure out whether Hamas actually is a threat to the United States at all, or whether maybe we could, well, like you, I think perhaps we're suggesting, maybe we could use Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's old terrorist group Jandala to murder people inside Iran to help foment regime change there. Things like that, rather than just saying anybody that the Likud party doesn't like basically is a threat to the American people and must be dealt with.
An honest question. So I know there's intelligence here, and we're all on the same page. We want to analyze radical Islam. We want to understand what's a real threat and what just doesn't agree with our way of life. Okay? Some people are more comfortable with a world of burqas and stoning and honor killings and shaming, and others are less. Some want to confront it or stop it, and others say it's their problem. They're going to have to work it out. Some people say that Islam is compatible with Western civilization and democracy. Some people say they haven't yet gone through their Reformation, but they will, and it's not up to us to nudge them. I have always cataloged three main sources of the jihadi threat. They're not conflated. They're very, very different. The Muslim Brotherhood out of Egypt, which produced al-Zawahiri, the philosopher of al-Qaeda. The Sunni Wahhabists out of Saudi Arabia, which produces the madrasas around the world, and the princes run around, but basically it's a very aggressive, radical view, and that actually produced bin Laden. And then the non-Arab Shiite group out of Tehran, the Islamic Republic. They're all threats, I think, to civilization, to the West. Not Muslims, radical Islam, Islamization, fundamentalism, that which first oppresses Muslims itself, and attacked the Buddhist artwork, remember, in the mountains of Afghanistan, and goes after the Christian Copts in Egypt, or has now moved into Europe in some significant ways, right? There are no-go zones. Police dare not go to parts of Europe where there's rape and all kinds of stuff, because those are off limits now. I could catalog, but I won't because I've already spoken too long. I could catalog now the financial and the ideological and the actual jihadi threat here. You remember Fort Hood, right? You remember the murder of America's best at the largest U.S. military base in the United States, Fort Hood. And you're aware of the threat of the palace in Dallas using chemicals from beauty supply shops. And you're aware of fundraising and other risks. There is a jihad. It declared war on us in 1998. That's bin Laden's group, right? You mentioned Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He personally murdered my high school pal, Daniel Pearl, the journalist. He beheaded him. So I don't want to overstate. It's not scaremongering. There is a jihad. It has many different, not to be conflated, sources and ideologies. It's possible they're pitted against each other. They compete against each other. I take your point. They shouldn't be conflated.
Comments? Okay. I'd like to bring up my friend and colleague, Joe Totten. And you've all been so civil. You've been really great about it. Let's mix it up a little bit, though. I'd like to hear some very tough questions for these panelists. So Joe is going to go out to the audience there. And who has a question for the panel? Come on, come on. All right. How about you, Bob Melsh? You got anything? You got... Oh, we have a question right here. All right, very, very good.
Thank you for this opportunity. I have a question for Mr. Greenfield. Since Putin came to the power, he always said that I will sell weapons to anyone to improve our economy. And since, as you said, they can make a nuclear weapon like a snap of the hand, what does it take to Putin to sell a couple of nuclear weapons to Iran for the right price? And second question, during the Cold War, the United States developed the Patriot system, which is anti-missile system. And currently they have modernized to Patriot 3, which is supposed to intercept any kind of missiles, anti-radar, stealth, or any other. And taxpayers have paid a lot of money for that missile system. And it's currently deployed in the United States and in Israel. Isn't that supposed to protect our countries without from any danger? And why are we scared from a ballistic missile that was tested in Iran? Shouldn't we be protected? If it's the case, shouldn't we be worried right now because some radical in Russia might fire any kind of missile and go through those systems that we have developed and spend lots and lots of money and time? Thank you.
Thank you. If I understood your first part, it was, why don't we, if we think we need to, send in a destabilizing weapon or attack command and control in Iran? Okay, I didn't understand the first part of your question. I apologize. Can I just answer the second part then? Because I just didn't get the first part. About missile defense systems. So we have had, since Ronald Reagan on March 23rd, 1983, a program for missile defense. In a sentence or two, Ronald Reagan thought it was not appropriate for statesmen to have no response other than wiping out an entire civilization if their dictator, for example, launched a first strike against us. He thought, no, I'd like to have the ability to knock it down. Rather than have a second strike, our response, wipe out the entire Russian people if they launched a first strike against us. It was mocked as Star Wars. But actually, you can hit a bullet with a bullet, and we made a lot of progress. And we now have interceptors in Alaska and California and on our Aegis cruise ships in the Gulf region, for example. So we have rudimentary missile defense. They get better and better. Now we're working on laser systems on the coast in California. We just had a good test in Point Mugu. And you're right, the Israelis have a rudimentary system where they're going to try to be able to knock down rockets, mortars, and missiles with lasers themselves. But these systems can be overwhelmed. What if the enemy launches tens and tens of missiles? You know, Pakistan, by the way, has 60 to 100 nuclear weapons. I'm sure the panel will agree to that. So it's not fanciful for us to imagine that North Korea, Pakistan, certainly already China and Russia, and these are all allies of, or at least trading partners with Iran, that they'll be able to develop missile systems with rudimentary weapons. That's why missile defense is important, but it's clearly not placed everywhere that it needs to be, and it certainly can't yet compete with an overwhelming force sent against it.
Comments? Further comments from the panel? Anything?
I would just say I don't see any indication that the Russians would prefer to have a nuclear-armed Iran on their southern border there, just near their southern border, or any indication that the Iranians or the Russians or Chinese are trying to help or would want to try to help Iran obtain nuclear weapons. I mean, the Russians could give them a hydrogen bomb the day after tomorrow if they wanted to, but they have not chosen to do so.
Okay, Joe, do we have another question? We do have from Bob Melch. Bob is former regional director of the Democratic Party. So go ahead, Bob.
Thank you. This is not a partisan question, however. Mr. Greenfield, as a no, I won't get into your background. In all seriousness, you've spoken several times about our relations with Israel, and I'm wondering how you can continually justify our support of a nation which is practicing genocide against Palestinians, which refuses to negotiate, takes an impossible position, and it really is misleading us about its intentions when they, probably more than any other reason, were the cause of 9/11.
Well, let me just say that the Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences wanted me to mention that there will be a panel specifically on Israel-Palestine. You're trying to divert us from every time Israel-Palestine gets mentioned, it's like, whoop, here we go. But he will be doing a panel on Israel-Palestine on the 20th of this month at 4:15. And yeah, I absolutely will. But that will be in the Humanities and Social Sciences room 1500, featuring a panel of distinguished faculty members. Larry, let's go ahead and answer that.
So you'll hear kindness in my voice. There was a time when support for Israel was wildly bipartisan in this country. To my sadness on one hand, that the party of Harry Truman and JFK and Scoop Jackson, resolute on national security and strongly pro-Israel, has now clearly been a split party. I don't even think Barack Obama and the left wing of the Democratic Party would claim that Israel's committing genocide. I think that's a little bit over the line, but you're entitled to your view. I will say I think the evidence is pretty clear to everybody that the Israelis have unilaterally withdrawn from Gaza and from their security zone in Lebanon, and they talked about withdrawing from the West Bank, and they have tried over and over. Their people march for peace. They have songs dedicated to peace. They said yes to the UN originally in 47, 48. There should be 2 states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs. I think the evidence is pretty clear. You could read Barbara Tuchman from Time Immemorial, one of the more important books. She started out wanting to be critical of Israel, and she said all the evidence adds up that the Israelis repeatedly reached out for peace and compromise. Hamas's manifesto calls for genocide against the Jewish people. There's been no Arab state other than Egypt and Jordan which reciprocated Israeli peace moves. The Arab League just came out and said we're against even the survival of Israel. We might do a temporary hudna for tactical purposes. We might negotiate with Israel, but in the long run, we don't want a Jewish or Judeo-Christian presence in the Middle East. 85 to 90% of Republicans in the Gallup poll that came out 3 weeks ago said they support a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. It's now under 50% among Democrats. I think that's good for the Republican Party politically, but bad for the U.S.-Israel relationship, and certainly bad for a tiny Jewish state. 6 million, now 7 million in the Middle East, 360 million Arabs, 1.3 billion Muslims. I know which side most of the American people are on.
I saw you scribbling furiously, Christopher. Did you want to say something?
No, it's just I think it's interesting that you can talk about various Iranian atrocities or signs of repression, and at the same time ignore the fact that in recent years and decades Israel has committed a variety of crimes in the West Bank and Gaza. Just in 2009 with the bombing of a UN school and various other things that were clearly and patently against the norms of international law and just basic decency. So I think that there's a double standard when we talk about our allies and our supposed enemies, where on the one hand we can freely demonize repressive practices, and on the other hand we simply ignore them, justify them, and call them not what they are.
Okay. I do want to get back to Iran, but Reese, I think you have something.
I'll make 2 short points. In my book on Iran, I have a chapter on the...
Would that be this book?
I have a whole chapter on the Israeli-Lebanon War of 2006, where you can read in much greater detail. But basically, Israel pulled out of Lebanon and pulled out of Gaza, not out of the kindness of its heart, but because it was defeated militarily in the case of Lebanon and could not continue the occupation of Gaza. And Israel, if it wanted peace, it could have negotiated a withdrawal from Gaza as part of a wider peace process. But it was I was there, I've been to Israel, I've reported there 6, 7 times. I remember very well the attitude, which is let them, wallow in their own muck in Gaza. We're going to pull out and protect our troops. So there was nothing involved in peace in either of those pullouts that would have had any kind of a lasting peace. The Arab League, in fact, issued a declaration in 2002 that called for a 2-state solution. There's nothing there about destroying Israel or maintaining an all-Arab country or anything of that kind. The Arab League, as well as the Palestinians, including Hamas, by the way, if the Israelis pulled out to the 67 borders, returned the land to Syria and Lebanon, establish a viable Palestinian state with a capital at least in part of East Jerusalem, there would be peace in Israel. And you're going to say, oh no, Hamas is not for that. I interviewed Khalid Mashal, and he told me on tape, as well as to other interviews, that that is indeed their position. So, there is the potential for peace, and it's not the Arabs and the Palestinians who are blocking it, it's the Israeli government.
You've interviewed a number of interesting people. Your new book, the one you're working on now, is just let us know what that is.
Oh, you want me to plug that too?
Oh, it's not out yet.
I don't happen to have that book yet because it's not published, but it is going to be published in September. It's called Conversations with Terrorists, Middle East Leaders on Politics, Violence, and Empire. and it features interviews with Khalid Mashal, President al-Assad of Syria, Gula Cohen of Israel, Ayatollah Fadlallah, and various other leaders from Lebanon and Afghanistan.
You're a brave man. Point of information, Larry, the book From Time Immemorial was not written by Barbara Tuckerman. It's Joan Peters.
My mistake.
Okay. Joe, do we have another question? We have one. Okay.
Firstly, let me just thank you all for coming out. I'm actually a creative writing major here, doing my currently working on my senior thesis with Reza Aslan.
Ah, yes. Uh-huh.
Indeed, yes. It involves Iran and the Green Revolution and all that good stuff. My question, I kind of was going to go in one direction, but then, Mr. Greenfield, you said that things would be better off with a regime change, and that kind of got me thinking about that. And I was wondering, what sort of regime change were you referring to? Because I think, I might agree with you on theory, but I have to wonder how you actually go about getting that regime change. If you're talking about any sort of internal some sort of internal shift, history is littered with examples of bad regimes that have simply been replaced with even worse ones. And if you're talking externally, I think all four panelists have done a good job of pointing out the pure, military risks if we were to ever actually get involved in that sort of way. And there are many, many, many examples in this, how utterly horrific that would be. So my question then, to kind of wrap that all up, is, what sort of regime change are you looking for, and what would be the best and most ideal way to go about it? Thanks.
Right. So it's a spectrum. I mean, the regime change that was best after World War II was to complete the fight until victory, and then assist with the Marshall Plan in democratization. And we created allies and trading partners, and today the Japanese people and the German people are good friends of the United States, of liberty, of human rights, and they're leaders in the world, and they're productive, constructive allies. So when regime change finally came to many of the communist countries, and America, through the Cold War and with our allies, stood up against tyranny, and President Reagan said, tear down this wall, and we did things. We had Voice of America, and we sent in to Germany, remember the airlift. We helped. We helped in a lot of ways. Americans stood up, Christians and Jews had holiday celebrations where they honored dissidents in faraway lands, and we fought for freedom in many ways, ideologically, through our words. Sometimes we helped dissidents. Sometimes we gave the Soviets a bloody nose. There were battles in Central America. Now, I think the world would do well, and the citizens of Araby and the Muslim world generally, including Iran, would do well with regime change. Forever they're going to have no democracies in the Arab world, or very limited. Forever the women and the children won't have economic growth and path in the Arab world. 1.3 billion Muslims can't join Western civilization eventually. It doesn't have to look like the United States. It's not going to be Madisonian democracy. But they too will be written off. They'll never have freedom. I don't think so. I think reform will come to the Arab world eventually. And can we help? Yes, in lots of ways, mostly ideological and mostly by being decent people ourselves and being a model. If you want to, you can Google tonight, you can Internet tonight, you can Facebook tonight, freedom fighters, dissidents, people seeking regime change and liberty all over the world. Digital diplomacy and digital democracy. They want your friendship. Many of them are stuck behind tyranny. We're just lucky we're here. So I don't know exactly what regime change will look like. Something could come along worse. Yes, but it's not worse now in Poland and the Czech Republic. It's not worse in Germany and Japan. It's not worse in Iraq. It's far better than Saddam Hussein. And I would hope, with our help, it'll be much better in Iran.
Scott, do you have something?
Yeah, well, a couple things. First of all, I guess I'll start with the last thing there. The people in Iraq, well, the 2.5 million people have fled Iraq to Jordan and Syria and have yet to come home. So it's not that much better, according to their point of view, if we're to believe which direction their feet are pointed. Also, Saddam Hussein was a secular fascist dictator, and really, in a real sense, he was a lot more like Tony Soprano than a Hitler. And he basically had to, arrange marriages, cut deals, business partnerships, tribal arrangements and compromises, and playing different factions off each other, and this is how he stayed the dictator of that country. One of the things that he insisted on was that there was no religious infighting allowed whatsoever. And so Chaldean Christians and Assyrian Christians lived by the thousands in Iraq, as well as Jews lived by the thousands in Iraq, and they were protected by Saddam Hussein's tyranny, and no one was allowed to mess with them at all. They're virtually all gone now, as well as the Yazidis and many other minority religious groups. They're some of these societies, the Chaldean Christians, the Yazidis, they go back in Iraq for 2,000 years or more, and they're gone. They do not exist anymore. In the entire south of Iraq, because despite all what you've heard about the surge worked and the great victory, there is still no real monopoly government in the country. The government of Baghdad is the government of everything between Baghdad and Kuwait, basically. And they regard a woman's smile to be a crime. They are the Ayatollahs. They are the thugs of the Mahdi army and the Supreme Islamic Council. And they are the worst persecutors. There are no women wearing blue jeans and teaching college in Iraq now like there were, just before this time, 2003. Women's rights has been completely destroyed in Iraq. Secularism has been completely destroyed in Iraq. All of the parties, well, aside from Alawis now, are religious-based. And the entire civil war that was precipitated in that country, which resulted in the death of over 1 million people, was fought along religious and factional lines because of America's invasion and toppling of the minority dictatorship and installing the majority in power. Again, the majority that is best buddies with the Ayatollahs in Tehran. In fact, the Iraqi National Congress that supplied all the lies about the biological weapons laboratories and the warehouses full of sarin and anthrax and the reconstituted nuclear weapons program and all of that. Their headquarters was in Tehran. And the CIA and the DIA later did a report, and they said, oh no, it looks like Ahmed Chalabi from the Iraqi National Congress was actually an Iranian spy doing Iran's work, lying us into war against their avowed enemy, Saddam Hussein. You might remember, some of you gray hairs, that the Americans used to back Saddam Hussein in order to contain the Iranian Revolution back in the 1980s. All George Bush did was reverse that policy and bring the Iranian Revolution into the south of Iraq. Again, more than 1 million people are dead. More than 5 million people have been displaced from their homes. Half of those are still in Jordan and Syria. And you call that they're better off now? The ones that lived through that, who still have no sewage, no regular electricity? Please, I'd like to think I was insulted, but it's kind of too ridiculous to even be insulting.
You can Google, they take polls of Iraqis all the time. Are you better off now or when there were rape rooms and human shredders and the
There were no
oppression?
shredders ever. There's not a single shred of evidence anywhere in the world that there ever was.
You're also wrong about the
It's just a
sarin and
lie.
the anthrax. Please Google sarin and anthrax and what we found in Iraq when we liberated Iraq.
Right. See, if you say a lie over and over again, it sounds like it might be true, right? Human shredders? Does that sound believable to anybody here?
Okay, are you also aware that Saddam Hussein translated Mein Kampf and distributed it to the Ba'athist police force that he had? Do you agree with that?
Well, I don't know about that, but I don't see how that's threatening to anybody except the Jews that those police had the job of protecting in Iraq, that they always did up until we regime changed them? I'm not sure.
No, he did.
How many Jews live in Iraq now? You talk about Mein Kampf.
Most of the Jews left Iraq in the 1940s in the big immigration to Israel.
Right. And of the ones left there in 2003, did most of them leave or stay since then, Mr. Greenfield?
That's a thin reed to argue that Iraq is not better off today than it was 7 years ago.
And what about if we bomb the tens of thousands of Jews in Iran? Would they be better off then?
There's 20,000 Jews in Iran, and if they
That's
could,
tens of thousands, isn't it?
yeah, and if they could get out, I'm sure they would.
Before we bomb
I
them?
really prefer
That's
to allow
advice to any Iranian Jews in the
I prefer to
YouTube
allow the
audience tonight.
conservatives to duke it out. I'm just sitting here. No, I
Don't call
think
me a conservative, or you'll find yourself on the other end of my argument.
I apologize. Reese? I apologize. If you look at the statistics in Iraq, the level of electricity, the amount of oil produced, the GDP, the standard of living, all are worse off today than under Saddam Hussein. And at the time of Saddam Hussein's overthrow, Iraq had been subject to 10 or 15 years of sanctions, 13 years of sanctions, so their economy was far reduced. By any reasonable standard, the economy is worse off today than it was under Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein ran a horrible dictatorship. I was there. Yes, he did. I saw Mein Kampf for sale in Iraq when I was there in 2003. So what? You know, it proves that he's a horrible dictator who admired Hitler, and there's lots of evil people like that around the world. Should we be going around overthrowing the governments in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia, in lots of places in the world where there are non-democratic dictatorships? And, you know, a final point, the elections, you know, the proof of the democracy is somehow that there were elections. They held elections. There's no free press in Iraq. There's no civil society in Iraq. There's certainly not a democracy. The people who won can't form a government because the Shia, you know who's making the decisions now about who will the next government of Iran be? They're holding meetings in Tehran. All of them, al-Maliki, al-Sadr, the head Skiri, or the renamed Skiri, they're all in Tehran figuring out how they're going to create a new government and ace Alawi by eliminating several of his parliamentary members because they were supposedly Ba'athists. And that's engineered by Ahmed Chalabi, who was defended by the Wall Street Journal as a great patriot in Iran. Can I say he was a hero of conservatives? I think I can say that. And, you know, that's the reality of Iraq.
Conservatives specifically. Yeah.
Actually, he was discredited by almost everybody, and I wouldn't pin on one guy, one conspiracy theory guy who's been discredited the entire Iraq project. I don't really want to litigate the Iraq project. However, I admit it is instructive for what we do next regarding Iran. And I am the first to stipulate we're not out to overthrow every regime. There are a lot of bad people in the world. In the particular case of Iran, they seem to be the leader of terrorism around the world. I haven't heard that addressed. How are we going to slow down or stop the Iranian terrorism?
Okay, one more question. We have a question here.
Am I on? Yes. I first wanted to appreciate Dr. or Mr. Erlich, because you couldn't be more accurate about things you said about Iran, and I really appreciate it.
Are you referring to Reese Erlich? Erlich?
Erlich, yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Erlich. And I want to appreciate Mr. Greenfield, too, because of his mercifulness, because at some point he said he's not calling for a missile launch in Iran tonight. I want to thank you. And I want to acknowledge your immense ability to manipulate truth, because during your short, more than 5 minutes speech, you made many wrong points. I couldn't take them all down. Some of them were answered by your colleagues there, like deliver missiles which we're not capable of, and they're not more work as a stopping force against other forces that are threatening us, and we have had some of them all the time. We've never used them, even against Iraq when we were in war with them. So we never used chemical weapons or any other weapons of mass destruction even against our enemies in war. But other things that have not been addressed, you said something about women's rights and the issues with divorce and stuff in England, and they're not so in Iran. They have all the rights they want, and they're protected by laws. And it's generally a good idea not to make claims about things that you're not sure about. About capturing Kurdish people in Europe, I haven't seen any proof of that, ever. And on the other hand, we all remember CIA's secret airports and facilities in Eastern Europe that were on the news a few years ago. Again, you addressed Baluchis, and your colleagues mentioned Jundullah. you tend to invite people to Google things up. I am asking the audience to Google Jundullah and how they beheaded our border patrol many times and posted the videos all over the internet. You can look them up. So there are a terrorist group supported by the United States, and there are Baluchis. And even if Iran has captured any of the Baluchis, those were the ones in contact with USA and belonging to Jundullah. And you said something about 72 virgins and stuff like that. That's not a Shiite belief. That's a Sunni belief, mostly taken into consideration by those extremist groups like Al-Qaeda, which were supported by CIA. And talking about Al-Qaeda and the CIA, we go to...
When you say supported by CIA, are you referring to the 1980s in Afghanistan?
In Afghanistan,
I see.
where they were supported against the Soviet Union. And you were talking about, do people go to school in Afghanistan now and how they weren't going to school then? And I'm asking you why they weren't before. Wasn't it because of that regime that you supported in Afghanistan only because of your own interests against Soviet Union? And now you're overthrowing them and claiming that you liberated them? Liberation. You talk about liberating Iraq and tend to use that liberating phrase instead of occupying. You occupied Iraq. You didn't liberate them.
Okay, is that it? Can we get to the point? It's a long question.
Yeah. You made many points. I'm not sure if I can address them as quickly as you did. There are still many points here, but I guess we're short on time.
All right. Okay, very well. Larry, I think that was directed at you, if I'm gathering that correctly. All right.
So what's great is that we can have this dialogue and have a nuanced, I think, path where maybe our views and our understanding of facts come more together than being so wide apart. I want to ask you a sincere question. If we're so bad, and you sort of used an accusatory you, why are you here? I mean, I know why I'm here, because of democracy and human rights and liberty. I actually have traveled throughout the Middle East, and I know the status of women throughout the Middle East. I'll give you another example, Saudi Arabia. Women can't drive in Saudi Arabia. And you're nodding yes. So from our safe confines here in Southern California, I think it's easy to be dismissive of claims of wanting to advocate for human rights or, yes, liberate people. I'll give you another example because it is somewhat relevant. In Darfur, right? I'm sure there's been movements and activism related to Darfur. The president hasn't lifted a finger. In fact, he's sort of compromised with the regime there. I wish he had done a lot more there. I actually do call for some sort of force that would be on call. It may never have to be used because tyrants might realize, wow, there may be an effort to stop genocide. The Janjaweed on horseback using machetes, chopping off the heads of the men and then raping the women. There's no men around. Yeah, so I'm sorry that we have such far apart views. I wish they would come more together, but I'm glad you're here and can speak your mind. You can't do so in much of the world.
Scott Horton.
Well, I'm very concerned with individual rights, whether in this country or anywhere else. But the step between being concerned about individual rights in other countries and being for American military aggression against those very women and children and individuals in those countries in order to supposedly help them is a pretty far sight. And you know, it's easy to talk about, well, we helped rebuild France after World War II, and no doubt they welcomed us as liberators there. But, you know, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who led the Iranian Revolution in 1979, that wasn't actually, you might have been able to tell by the pictures, the big gray beard, it wasn't his first event. In fact, he helped the CIA overthrow the Prime Minister Mossadegh and reinstall the Shah, the fascist dictator whose Soviet secret police force skinned people alive. And it was just a little bit of blowback when the Ayatollah Khomeini decided that his group could go ahead when the Shah was sick and his government was falling from power and seize power for themselves in 1979. And in fact, there were at least parts of the State Department and the CIA who said, oh, we like the Ayatollah Khomeini. We know him from back in '53. He helped us overthrow Mossadegh. So we'll go ahead and let him come into power. It'll be fine. They called the French and said, yeah, let him leave Paris and go back to Iran. And he became that dictator. And in fact, you may or may not be familiar with that term blowback. It doesn't just mean consequences. It means consequences from secret, covert foreign policies that the American people don't understand. So that, for example, when planes come out of the clear blue sky one morning and crash into your tower, you believe the Republicans when they tell you they hate you because you're free and good. Because as far as you know, America hasn't been slaughtering Iraqis every day for 12 years leading up to that from bases on the Arabian Peninsula, or supporting kings and emirs and dictators throughout the Persian Gulf area, etc., etc. So that's what blowback means, and the Ayatollahs that currently rule Iran are exactly blowback, and that phrase was actually coined by a CIA analyst after the coup of '53 when he said, boy, we're going to have some blowback coming down the line from this. And that's what you get when America gets involved in other people's regime changes, is you get dictatorship. Look at what they did to the Palestinians. They demanded that the Palestinians hold elections. And then when Hamas won, they turned a blind eye and told the Likud, go ahead and build a wall around them and turn Gaza into the prison by the sea, like Escape from New York with Kurt Russell. And put a blockade on it and refused to let people import food and clothes and medicine. They turned it into a giant prison. And then look what happens in Lebanon when they demand new elections in Lebanon. They demand Syria out of Lebanon. George Bush, literally during the run-up to the Iraqi elections of 2004, said on TV live, you can't have a fair election under occupation. Meaning the Syrians, who America had originally invited to occupy southern Lebanon so we could get them on board for our first war against Iraq in '91, had to go. Well, who filled the giant power vacuum in southern Lebanon when the Syrian army left? That's right, Hezbollah. And they won seats in the parliament, and then what did America do? Immediately told the Israelis, go ahead and start bombing them, because they won the election that we demanded they have. That's American regime change policy in effect in the Middle East. Again, the Ayatollahs now ruling Iraq. Talk about women's rights have to cover their heads and wear all these things. That's not how it was in Iraq until after America's regime change there. And on like that. Ask people from Brazil or from Argentina or whatever how they like it when America does a regime change in their country. The ones who haven't disappeared and tortured to death.
Thanks for mentioning Kurt Russell. Okay.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Always try to.
Yeah, Reese Erlich, and then we're making a special exception for 2 more questions. Reese.
Actually, I'm going to pass.
Oh, you're going to pass. Okay. We have a distinguished visitor here, the director of the Islamic Center, the mosque here in Riverside, Dr. Mustafa Kuko.
Thank you. Thank you, Luis, and thanks for the panelists tonight. It's always unfair for the panelists, for someone like me who came at the middle of the program to comment on anything, but just actually using my expertise as someone who is actually also from the Middle East, born over there, stays there a part of my life. I could comment a few things here and there, and I have also noticed some inaccuracies during the talk of some of the panelists that I need to allude to. Number one, most of the time that I attend those such kind of programs, most of the time we talk about the symptoms rather than the root causes. And the root cause of what is going on in our homeland is the messy American foreign policy. That's it. It's been like that for decades and decades, and actually since World War II. And what made Iran as it is today is the intervention of the CIA and the also errant American policy. since the time of Mossadegh in 1951, and when Kermit Washington, or Kermit Eisenhower went over there, and they toppled the regime, and they brought back the Shah and supported a very oppressive regime, and actually it's very slow to support the movement for change in Iran, and now the American foreign policy is reaping the harvest of what they have sown, and so on and so forth. You know, if you go to Equatorial Guinea, if you go to Sudan, which is my own country, which is where you go to Chad, or you go to Indonesia, or Brazil, or Paraguay, or wherever, and you look into their own foreign policy, there's always a common thread. The foreign policy serves the country and serves the people of the country. The only foreign policy that does not serve its own people is the American foreign policy. It serves whom we don't know. It's always counterproductive, all through. And I'm not prepared, with all due respect to Mr. Larry, I'm not prepared to listen to anyone having my daily contact with the people in the Middle East. I'm not prepared to listen to anyone who is going to tell me that Iraq today is better than Iraq during the time of even Saddam Hussein. That is not acceptable at all, you know. We, as Americans, we left a ruined country, a devastated people, terrible, terrible stuff that's going over there, and this sham elections. And then we have all of this kind of double standards, you know. Ahmed Karzai is a corrupt leader in Afghanistan who actually won an election, which is also a corrupt election, at least to say it's a tainted election, you know, and we're embracing him, you know. When Hamas won the election a few years ago, we were against it, you know. So there's so much of double standards, and that's why the people are changing, actually. Like, I'll be quoting a Sudanese physician who used to live in Kuwait. And he said, well, we're blaming for whatever goes over there in our homelands, we're blaming the administration. But he was telling us, so you people, well, George Bush is doing whatever he's doing. But once you elected him in 2004, then we understand that all of you are against us. It's not only Bush or his administration, but everyone who elected George Bush is against us. And this is a sentiment in the Middle East right now, unfortunately. You know. It is the American foreign policy. Unless the American foreign policy changes drastically, things are not going to change, and things are going to go from west to west. Secondly, the second comment, there is nothing called Al-Qaeda. Nothing, period. Period. This is just a disparate groups, disgruntled individuals, small groups here and there. They have no central, power or authority or control whatsoever. Osama bin Laden is living in a cave in Afghanistan or on the borders of Pakistan, you know, and everybody is acting on his own, whether in Yemen, whether in wherever it is, you know. There is nothing called Al-Qaeda right now, you know. So we just make these things, those who are the fear mongers are trying to put the fear in the heart of everyone that Al-Qaeda that's going to strike anyone. And the third thing the third comment that I will go to what Larry said, you know, he said he draws his example for whatever is going there from three things. Number one, the organization of Zawahiri. It's a defunct organization. Zawahiri does not have a single member of organization right now living in Egypt whatsoever. That even himself, he has pulled himself out of that organization and became a lieutenant for Osama bin Laden. Secondly, you mentioned the Wahhabis. The Wahhabis, they draw their whatever they do from the opinions and ideas of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Ahmad ibn Hanbal has never mentioned jihad in his whatever he said or whatever he wrote whatsoever, you know. And then Iran, you know what's going on in Iran, and you know who caused all that, you know. So the Wahhabis, actually, they differ from other Muslims in their own interpretations, strictly in the Islamic jurisprudence, no more, no less. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kuko. There's a lot to talk about there, but let's get to the next question, the last question from this gentleman here, who I appreciate you have been patronizing the barn here. I see a pitcher of beer, so thank you for that. So,
thank you. First of all, I just wanted to say, well, I appreciate all Americans. I'm a fifth-generation American, and I wanted to say that, Christopher Records, I despise your words that no good has come out of our service in Iraq as an Iraq war veteran. You can you can't tell me that with the little children and women and girls that I've seen that were paranoid of Saddam Hussein's sons going to any school and taking them out of class to take them to one of their rape rooms. So you're ill-informed. The second thing, I have a three-pronged question. Dr. Erlich, or Mr. Reese Erlich, you mentioned that the IAEA had previously reported that Iran had a nuclear military program and that they no longer since do that. Why would we trust that they're going to just reverse course? For Mr. Horton, his libertarian views, in my opinion, are very valuable as to play devil's advocate. And I think, I'm wondering if maybe he just feels that, as is my opinion in some cases, that some of these countries play the United States, choose our side and help us win for our cause, and we help them for a little bit, and then it reverses course. And that question also goes to Mr. Greenfield.
Oh, okay. Let's start with a response, and let's go down the line here. Reese Erlich.
Yeah, I think there was a confusion. What I said was the NIE, the National Intelligence Estimate, that was issued by the U.S. agencies in '07, said that the Iranians had a nuclear weapons program. They didn't have a bomb developed, but they had a nuclear weapons program up until 2003, and it stopped and has not resumed. So that was not the IAEA, it was the National Intelligence Estimate.
Larry Greenfield.
Well, I would just say, maybe this is my closing remark.
What I wanted, if you could respond, and then each panelist will have a closing statement.
So I'll respond on the question of blowback, which I think is sort of implied in both. I tried to make clear that we were not on the side, there was no Taliban during the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. There was one group we were on the side with, which was pro-Western and pro-U.S., and the leader of that was murdered the night before 9/11. It is a canard, and it was brought up earlier, that we invented or we sponsored or we created bin Laden or Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. It's not true. And it fits a pattern of blaming the United States for things that happened. Yes, there was CIA activity in the 1950s in Iran. I don't think that is relevant to the understanding now of the 30-year-old Islamic Republic, which threatens its own people and its region and the West. By the way, it was Jimmy Carter, and I'm the first one to say, who was wrong to welcome Ayatollah Khomeini. They called him a prince. Andrew Young at the UN, the Carter administration blundered badly. The Shah was bad, but he was a prince compared to what this 30-year Islamic Republic has been, which basically was the foundation for the revival of the third jihad. My last sentence. Kind sir, for all your complaints and concerns, we must have done something right with American foreign policy over 200 plus years, because millions and millions of people kept coming here and wanted liberty and wanted freedom. We haven't been perfect. But if you're that hostile to America and the American government and American foreign policy, show me a better one out there that's liberated peoples. We claim no land in Europe after World War II. 12 million Americans served in uniform overseas, without regard to political party, by the way. How many millions more served here at home? Rosie the Riveter, right? We claim no land in Europe, only plots to bury our sacred dead who volunteered, enlisted, and served abroad to liberate peoples. I'm pretty proud of America. You don't seem to have that same sense in your voice, and I'm sorry to hear it.
Christopher Records.
Well, let me just say to the gentleman that I obviously respect his service and the service of all U.S. servicemen and women. I don't dispute your good intentions, and I don't dispute that you've done good, and that American men and women in Iraq and Afghanistan have done humanitarian work, building schools and other things like that for the people that have improved their lives in certain areas. But I think in Iraq, no one can dispute the fact that there's been immense human suffering, and many of us look at the results of the invasion and say that hundreds of thousands of dead, Iraqi men, women, and children, living conditions much diminished, we don't look at that and see an improvement. The fact is that people are still suffering in Iraq and have suffered over the past 7 years immensely. So while I respect all U.S. servicemen and women, I disagree with the U.S. military approach to situations such as Iraq, and I think that they cause more problems than they solve.
Scott Horton.
Well, I was thinking maybe some of those people have come here in order to escape our foreign policies by getting on the safe side of the wall, and all the fire is directed outwards. Something to think about. My position, sir, is actually not meant to be a devil's advocate, but a position I truly believe in, which is, frankly, basically the position that George Washington took in his farewell address. And that said that America should have no entangling alliances with any foreign powers. At the time that he gave his speech, there were a lot of very hardcore pro-French partisans and pro-British partisans and pro-Greek partisans and different lobbies we dealt with back then. But there were people who then were pushing for America to join in the war on Britain's side against France, on France's side against Britain, on everybody's side against everybody. And George Washington said that our purpose is to guarantee the liberty for ourselves and to serve as an example to the rest of the world. And if they want to be like us, if we can really do our best, not in any magical Marxist sense, but do our best to perfect our own society, we will serve as a great example for others to try to follow. But that once we attach ourselves and our passions to the interests of foreign powers, now we make enemies out of all of their enemies. And now we get ourselves into a bunch of problems that we didn't necessarily have anything to do with. A few years after that, of course, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, all of them basically endorsed that same policy. John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, gave a great speech on the 4th of July in 1821 where he said, "America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. America is the champion and vindicator only of her own." And that specifically at the time, there was a revolution in Greece, and there were people who wanted, and it was a Republican revolution. And there were people who said, all right, America, this is made just for you. Let's get in our ships. Let's go and help those Greek Republicans guarantee their freedom. And John Quincy Adams said, no deal, because if we do that, we'll give up our own freedom. We'll find ourselves the dictatress of the world, and we won't be America anymore. And, it's technically true to say we didn't just come in and claim part of France for America, but we have an empire of bases of more than 1,000 military bases in more than 130 out of 190 countries in the world. We have economic, political, and military dominance in virtually every region of every continent on the planet. It's the greatest world empire in history. And as we all learn as 5-year-olds one way or another, all empires fall. This is one thing he said is, we look at American foreign policy and we wonder, well, who does it benefit? Because it surely is not for the benefit of the American people in general. And, of course, most of us know the answer to that. It's for the benefit of Northrop Grumman, and it's for the benefit of Lockheed, and it's for the benefit of the Wall Street banks that service the debt, and it's for the interests of the Iraqi National Congress that wants power in Iraq this time. It's in the interests of the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee that's trying to get us into a war with Iran right now. And in a democracy, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And so if a squeaky wheel can demand foreign intervention on behalf of one side or another in a dispute that's really none of our business, they'll get their way and we'll pay, as we are paying right now.
Okay, let's do a final statements from Larry Greenfield, Christopher Scott, and then the last statement from Reese Erlich. Larry Greenfield.
I actually applaud your analysis of George Washington and the founding. You're absolutely correct about that principled American original vision of no entangling alliances. And that is an important political philosophy and caution to America's foreign policy, and I think we should carry it with us to today. However, there's another piece of the puzzle. We live in the age of missiles. They fly 24/7, and they fly at night at the push of a button. And there are actually dragons out there, North Korea, China, Russia, and others. There are actually assaults on women and children and human rights abuses. There actually is a 1,400-year-old jihad which assaulted Christendom and Europe and blocked once outside of Tours and the second time outside of Vienna in 1683 on 9/11. And so bin Laden, in his declaration of war against Christendom and the Zionists, as he called them, when he declared war on us in 1998, actually meant it. And there really is terrorism, and there really is human rights abuse in Darfur, and guys on horses with machetes. And I'm not willing, as an American citizen, not to use our power of persuasion, our model, yes. The war of ideas and rhetoric, yes. Trade and alliances and diplomacy and financial dealing, yes. But occasionally American power to defend liberty, to promote human rights, to establish democracies, to try to build friendships. We will make mistakes. We can't be an island anymore. Solely the United States, Pax Americana, just sitting here alone and hope the world will get better. They want to come after our allies, our interests, our ships, our troops, and even us here. And guess what? I'm not making it up. There was a Fort Hood. There were people who were trained abroad and inspired on the internet from jihadists abroad who did do damage here. And by the way, if missiles landed here from our southern border or our northern border, you want to see how quick the American moms and dads are willing to do whatever it takes to wipe out any enemy? We've actually not had to be as tough as we may have to be if a foreign invasion ever did happen here. And it did happen twice. Pearl Harbor and 9/11. Nobody made that up. They did come here. We like to fight our wars over there. But you watch how tough we get if stuff happens here. You want to see political action? It's not AIPAC, a bunch of old Jews who go to Washington to say, we love Israel, Christians and Jews together. It's the American people. You watch how ferocious we get if the jihad actually comes here. One of the ways to try to prevent it was to fight over there. Has to be done prudentially, has to be done thoughtfully. Our government should tell us the truth about WMD and not make stuff up. I agree with all that. And your cautions are well taken, but we may not be farther than just the first inning in America's battle against the jihad. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Christopher Records, final thoughts.
God, that sounded familiar. 2002, 2003. The words of President Bush come to mind. Fool me once, shame on, well, don't fool me again. Especially talking about Iran, talking about Iraq and now talking about Iran, the same arguments come up. It's a combination of fear and this amorphous idea that America can come in and readily remedy everything at the stroke of a pen or a gun or whatever, and make democracy suddenly bloom overnight. And the fact is that the American people have been through this before. We've seen what happened in Iraq, and we're not going to fall for it again. Americans throughout this country, especially Americans of military age, the people I know, the people I talk to, are against war in Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, throughout the Middle East. They're against the idea that America can fix situations such as Iraq and Iran through military force, that we can suddenly make everything better with a gun and force people 10,000 miles away to suddenly drive Fords and live in gated communities and vote for their versions of Obama and McCain every 4 years. They just don't buy that anymore. So I'm confident that we're in the right.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Christopher. Scott Horton.
Okay, well, I would like to point out that at the time that all of America's founders were advising us to stay out of foreign entanglements, there were not intercontinental ballistic missiles. But the British Army was on our northern border, the Spanish Army was in Florida, actually, and to our south in Mexico, and the French, of course, controlled Louisiana, and America was surrounded by enemies at the time. That we weren't safe behind our oceans or any such thing at the time that they said to stay out of foreign entanglements. Also, I want to just really recommend a book to y'all who are interested. It's a book that was actually put out by the Gallup poll about 2 years ago, and they did a survey worldwide where they just interviewed thousands and thousands of Muslims in every land from Morocco to the Philippines, every Muslim land, and all over Europe and everywhere else. And there's just no disputing the fact, when you get through looking at this thing, that the clash of civilizations is a bunch of phony hype from people who have vested interests. And there are people who believe in the phony hype, but it's still a bunch of phony hype. The people of the Muslim world, what they don't like about America is when our government uses high explosives to tear their human lives apart. They don't mind R-rated movies. They don't care if your girlfriend can vote in a primary election. They never did hate our freedom. That's the part that they want to emulate the most. What they hate is our foreign policy, and that's just a fact. And that goes not just for the Muslim world at large, but that goes for Osama bin Laden and the crazies. Point of fact, Osama bin Laden declared war on the United States in 1996. 98 was like, hey, did you forget about me? I'm still coming for you. But 96 was the actual declaration of war. And it was called the Declaration of War against the Americans occupying the land of the two holy places, Saudi Arabia, because that's where we had our air bases, so that we could bomb Iraq on average of every other day for 10 years after the first Gulf War and throughout all of the Clinton administration. Bomb them every other day and forced a blockade that killed hundreds of thousands of people from bases near the Holy Land of Mecca and Medina. That was two-thirds of the declaration of war. The third of the declaration of war was Israel's Operation Grapes of Wrath in southern Lebanon. And the Qana massacre is how they pronounce it, when a bunch of women and children were killed. Nowhere in that declaration of war did he come out against primary elections or braziers or R-rated movies or any of the things that supposedly define our freedom. In fact, George Bush and his government and the media lied to you. Because if they wanted to tell you the truth about September 11th, they would have had to say, this is the price we pay for empire. We maintain a world empire, and we use our government to kill people whenever we feel like it. Occasionally, 3,000 or so of you are going to have to pay the price for that as people come to get their payback in blood. But, come on, you're for it, right? Come on, let's go invade the world. That wouldn't have worked, see? We wouldn't have gone for that. The price we pay, September 11th, not worth it. Not worth it. So instead they lied, and they said, well, they hate you because you're good, and you're a nice lady, and that's why they don't like you, is because they're evil and you're good. And so therefore, what other choice do we have? Back up against the wall with insane religious people, with insane religious motivations coming at us? All we can do is send our sons to go join the army. And it's a big lie. And there's just no question about it. You look at the foreign fighters, as they call them, who traveled to Iraq to fight. This was Israeli and Saudi studies that said that virtually all of them, 99.999% of them, were young kids radicalized by the invasion of Iraq. The only involvement that the old leftover mujahideen from Afghanistan had was doing logistics, arranging to send them there, maybe give them some money, a little bit of training. But the kids who went from Saudi Arabia, from Syria, from Libya, from Jordan to fight in Iraq, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, as they call them, they were all young guys, radicalized after the invasion began. It's true, there was a shooting at Fort Hood. a shooting by one Army guy against a bunch of Army guys who were literally, not just figuratively because they were at Fort Hood, but literally men who were all preparing to deploy to Afghanistan. And, you know, they say the guy had, you know, wanted to quit and went postal because they wouldn't let him quit his job, which is a problem with joining the military. You're not allowed to quit. But it was also pretty clear he's in contact with some of these radical clerics, and he sees, frankly, a bunch of American neoconservatives trying to convince us that we really are at war against Islam. Oh, radical Islam. But we're at war against Islam. So no wonder some Muslims would try to defend it. Look at Abdul Muttalib, who was the attempted Christmas Day bomber on the Detroit flight. Well, if you remember when Barack Obama gave his West Point speech in November, he said at the end of the speech, "Look out, Somalia, look out, Yemen, we're coming for you next." And at antiwar.com, we covered it, when for 3 weeks after that, America was bombing Yemen. And then somebody in Yemen put a Nigerian kid on a plane to do an attack over Detroit. And they imagined that on TV that history started all over again on Christmas Eve. There was no bombing of Yemen. This couldn't possibly be a retaliation for anything that just happened, even though we all know it's right in front of our eyes. Yeah, and in fact, I'll wrap this up here.
Yeah.
When the Chechen terrorists blow up Russian civilians, all the neocons come out on the side of the Chechen terrorists. Because if there's anything that, well, as we've seen, right, Jundullah, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's group, is preferable to the Iranians, right, even though it's Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's group. If the neocons hate your country more than jihad, then they'll go ahead and side with jihad against your country, and that includes Iran and Russia. And so when there's subway bombings in Russia, all the news reports say this is blowback from Russian foreign policy and their torture and murder in Chechnya.
Okay. All right.
Which one? Oh, did I not say it? Who really speaks for Islam by the Gallup poll? Pardon me.
Okay.
Oh, wait, there's a jihad going to invade us from Mexico? Did I understand that right? From the southern border, they're going to shoot missiles at us?
If you're not aware of Iran and Venezuela and Mexico, you can read up about it.
Okay. All right.
Iranian
So
missiles in
that's Scott
Mexico.
Horton's final statement. So let's
Thank
thank,
you.
thank Scott. And now, before Reese does his final statement, I want to say his books are, the lovely Tina Jonas is back there with the books. She's holding them up. And Reese will be happy to sell and sign any books for you. And also you will be welcome to chat with our panelists and say what you liked or disliked about their presentation. But now let's do the final statement from Reese Erlich.
Okay. I think it's worth going back a bit over Afghanistan, although that wasn't the main topic, because I think there has been a lot of misinformation tonight, and it's really the key to understanding a lot of these issues. 1979, Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. Strong reaction from the Afghan people. Resistance, armed resistance develops. The CIA gets over there very quickly. They do not put most of their money to Shah Massoud. They put the bulk of their money behind Hekmakhtiar. Why? Because he's the most conservative, most fundamentalist, most anti-communist of all the guerrilla groups fighting. Where is Hekmakhtiar today? He's fighting the U.S. in Afghanistan. He was a fundamentalist then. He's a fundamentalist today. He always opposed the West, but the U.S. opportunistically poured money into his operation because opportunistically we wanted to fight the Soviet Union. Along comes the U.S. enlists Saudi Arabia in the and Pakistan in the fight against Afghanistan, against the Soviet Union. The Saudis recruit people to come, as do the Pakistanis. One of them is bin Laden, who takes up lodging in Pakistan and starts doing a major fundraising for the Mujahideen with the CIA backing. It's simply a myth to say that there was no connection. Remember the blind sheikh, this guy who was later convicted of blowing up the World Trade Center the first time?
Abdul Rahman?
Say again?
Abdul Rahman.
Abdul Rahman. He was part of the CIA-supported Mujahideen in Afghanistan. He was given a visa by the U.S. authorities to come to New York to live after the Afghan war was over. And he then proceeds to organize the blowing up of the first World Trade Center, where they planted a truck bomb there. There is direct, and public information that the people that the United States supported, the ultra-rightist fundamentalists in Afghanistan, were precisely the people, when the war was over there, turned the jihad against the United States. And the U.S. is doing it all over again with groups like Jundullah in Iran, with the Pijak among the Kurds. It finds groups that have grievances against some government, arms them, gives them money, and then is all surprised when those people then turn on the United States somewhere down the line. It's perfectly predictable, and it's horrific. It's horrific for the people of that country, and of course it's horrific for the people of the United States. You know, the Fort Hood shooting was a horrible tragedy. I know the argument is it's an act of terrorism. Hey, if it was an act of terrorism, then so is the guy flying the plane into the IRS building in Austin. So is the, you know, countless numbers of white conservative people taking up arms in desperate actions against the government. If one is terrorism, the other is. If the second is not terrorism, then neither is the activities in Fort Hood. I do like that everyone's in support of George Washington, and I want to add my vote in favor of George Washington. And I want to stress that George Washington was opposed to all foreign entanglements except the ones that we like, apparently. And finally, I mean, you know, Muslim people are not the enemy. There was a lot of misinformation tonight about conflating all Muslims as being people who want to stone adulterers, and everyone wears burqas. And I mean, that is such a stereotype and evil misrepresentation of the Muslim world. I don't even know where to start, except to say, sure, are there reactionary Muslim governments who sanction things like that? Yeah. Are there governments where there were pedophile priests molesting children for 30 years and never getting away with it? Does that mean we're at war with Christianity? You know, right? You know, you apply the same logic, which is that if there are pedophile priests, then all Christians must be evil. And because there's some Muslims who believe in stoning, and by the way, a tiny, tiny minority of people even do something like that. You can't attribute, it's an old scare tactic, which is you find the most extreme examples of something and then blame the entire people for doing that. And you don't hear about Christian terrorists or Jewish terrorists, but somehow Muslim terrorists are out to get us. And with that, I would just say thank you very much for being here tonight.
Okay. Larry Greenfield, Christopher Records, Scott Horton, and Reese Erlich, please join me in thanking them. And Larry, I have to say, special thanks to you for coming here and being part of this panel, because I think you've been the object of some criticism. All right. Again, there are books by Reese Erlich, and he's happy to sign them for you. And you're very welcome to meet the panelists here. And thank you all very much for coming. And we're going to keep doing these forums. So thank you so much.